The Admiral was declared brain dead at 11:47 p.m. Every physician in the room agreed. Every monitor confirmed it. Every protocol pointed to one outcome: pull the support, document the time, move on. But Nurse Sarah Voss stood frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at a number on the cardiac screen that nobody else had noticed. A flicker, a pattern, something buried inside the noise that didn't belong in a dead man's body. She opened her mouth. The chief of trauma cut her off before she finished her first word. "You're a nurse," he said. "Not a doctor. Step back." Sarah stepped back. But she didn't look away. And that decision, that one quiet refusal to accept what she was told, was about to crack open a conspiracy that reached from a small Colorado hospital straight into the highest corridors of military power. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind we tell on this channel. Every week, we bring you cinematic stories of ordinary people who refused to be silenced and changed everything. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that hospital room, because something is very wrong with the man everyone just declared dead. The first thing Sarah Voss noticed when she arrived for her night shift was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the 2 a.m. quiet of a hospital doing what hospitals do in the dark. The soft rhythm of machines and distant footsteps, and the occasional murmur of a nurse passing a chart. This was the other kind. The kind where too many people stood too still in a corridor that should have had normal traffic, and where the faces she passed wore expressions they were working hard to keep neutral. She clocked in at 10:58 p.m., pulled her badge lanyard over her head, and had barely reached the nurse's station when Deb Alcott leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. "They brought someone in," Deb said. "Someone important?" Deb's eyes moved left, then right. "Admiral? Rear Admiral Harlan Vespri. They flew him in from some facility out past Garrett Pass. There was an explosion." She paused. "Or something like one. Nobody's saying exactly what." Sarah set down her bag. "Which bay?" "ICU 4, but Sarah Deb caught her arm. "Dr. Morrow's already in there with the trauma team, and there's 2 men in suits standing outside the door who aren't hospital staff. I'd just keep your head down tonight, okay?" Sarah nodded slowly. She had a habit of nodding when she wasn't actually agreeing. Halverton General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Dunmore, Colorado, a city of about 90,000 people that existed in that particular American geography, where the mountains stopped being dramatic and the plains started being honest. It wasn't a large hospital. It had 1 trauma bay that saw real action and 2 ICU wings that mostly handled post-surgical recovery and the occasional stroke or cardiac event serious enough to keep overnight. It was not, by any reasonable standard, a hospital equipped for whatever had just been wheeled through its doors. Sarah took the long route to the ICU. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Harlan Vespri's room. She'd been assigned to the North Wing, a recovering appendectomy in 14, a diabetic teenager in 16, and a 72-year-old named George Pittman who kept pulling out his IV line because he wanted to go home and watch his recorded baseball games. But she walked past ICU 4 slowly, the way someone does when they're pretending they're going somewhere else, and she looked through the interior window. The room was crowded for midnight. Dr. Preston Morrow stood at the center of it, which was where Preston Morrow always stood, physically and otherwise. He was 61 years old, had the posture of a man who believed his own press releases, and had been chief of trauma at Halverton General for 14 years. He wore his authority the way some men wore expensive watches, constantly, conspicuously, and with the expectation that you would notice. Beside him stood a radiologist Sarah didn't recognize, holding a tablet with brain scan images on the screen. 2 nurses from the trauma team stood near the wall, not speaking. And on the bed, connected to every monitor the room could offer, lay a man who looked like he'd been through something that had no clean name. Harlan Vespri was perhaps 65, broad-shouldered even in stillness, with a military short cut of gray hair and a face that had spent decades outdoors doing things that left marks. His left side showed the kind of burns that came from proximity to a pressure event rather than open flame, the skin red and swollen in the particular pattern that Sarah had learned to recognize years before she ever wore scrubs. There was a laceration above his right ear, sutured already, and his right hand was splinted at the wrist. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell with ventilator assistance. Sarah stood at the window for 11 seconds before she moved on. She told herself she was just being curious. She told herself a lot of things that night. Her assigned patients were straightforward. The appendectomy was sleeping and fine. The teenager had her insulin adjusted and her levels were stabilizing. George Pittman was awake, irritated, and had opinions about her decision to resecure his IV line, which he expressed at some length. "I keep telling everyone, he said, I feel fine. I felt fine before I came in, and I feel fine now. I just need to go home." "You had a blood sugar of 41 when they brought you in, George." "I've been lower." "That's not the reassurance you think it is," he grumbled. She checked his chart, made a note, and moved toward the door. "You're the only one who talks to me like a person," he said unexpectedly. She paused. "Everyone here talks to you like a person. They talk at me like I'm a problem to manage." He adjusted his pillow. "You talk to me like I'm someone who might have a point, even when I don't." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "Get some sleep, George." She went back to the hallway. The two men in suits were still outside ICU 4. One of them was on a phone call, turned slightly away. The other met her eyes as she passed and held her gaze with the particular blankness of someone trained to make you feel like you're the one being evaluated. Sarah kept walking. It was 12:31 a.m. when she came back. She didn't plan it exactly, or that's what she told herself. She'd been charting at the station down the hall, and the numbers had been circling in the back of her mind the way certain things did when they didn't quite fit. The cardiac readout she'd glimpsed through the window had been showing a heart rate variability pattern she'd seen before. Not in a hospital. Somewhere older than that. Somewhere she'd spent years trying to forget. She stopped at the window again. The radiologist was gone. One of the trauma nurses was gone. It was just Preston Morrow and one remaining nurse. And Morrow was doing the thing he did when he was wrapping up a case. Standing with his arms slightly crossed, weight back on his heels, the posture of a man delivering a conclusion. She could see the monitor clearly from here. The cardiac waveform was wrong. Not wrong in the way a dead man's cardiac waveform is wrong. Wrong in a more specific, deliberate way. The rate was consistent with deep unconsciousness, yes. But there were micro variations in the R2R intervals that didn't belong. Tiny. You could miss them in a full room in bad lighting on a night when you were tired and working from an assumption. Sarah was not working from an assumption. She went to the door and knocked once before opening it. Morrow turned around with the expression of a man who had not expected to be interrupted. The remaining nurse, Cassie Drummond, 3rd year, someone Sarah liked, looked up from the medication log with something that might have been relief. "Sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, and she did not sound particularly sorry. "I'm covering North Wing tonight, but I was passing and I wanted to ask, has anyone done a detailed review of the cardiac variability readout? Because the HRV pattern on the..." "He's unconscious," Morrow said. His tone was the verbal equivalent of a door closing. "Severe traumatic brain injury with corresponding neurological suppression. The scans are unambiguous." "I understand that. I'm asking specifically about the R to R interval variation, because the pattern I'm seeing is, you're a night nurse assigned to the North Wing." He said it without particular cruelty, which was almost worse. "This patient has been assessed by a trauma team, 2 attending physicians, and a radiologist. We don't need additional input." Sarah looked at the monitor, then at Morrow, then at Cassie, who was looking at the floor. "Of course," Sarah said. "I apologize for the interruption." She left. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back to the wall and her arms at her sides, and she breathed evenly, which was a skill she had developed a long time ago in conditions considerably more stressful than this one. Then she took out her phone and made a note. She documented the time, the room number, the specific values she'd observed on the cardiac monitor, and a brief clinical description of the HRV pattern. It took her 4 minutes. She kept the language neutral and precise. Then she went back to George Pittman, who was not sleeping. "Thought you left," he said. "I came back." She pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down, which she almost never did during a shift because there was almost never time. "Can't sleep?" Can't stop thinking. About baseball. About my wife. He was quiet for a moment. She passed 3 years ago. I still think about what she'd say about things. Tonight she'd say I was being stubborn about that IV. She'd be right. Yeah. A pause. She was usually right. Sarah sat with him for a few minutes, not saying much, just present. It was a thing she'd learned. Sometimes presence was the actual medicine, and everything else was just the delivery system. At 1:15 a.m., she went back to the window of ICU 4. Morrow was gone. The suits in the corridor had been reduced to 1. The remaining monitor readout was visible from her angle, and Sarah stood there long enough to watch a full 4-minute window of data. The pattern was still there. Cleaner now, actually, without the room full of people and stimulation. The micro-variations were subtle enough that you'd need to know what you were looking for. But Sarah knew what she was looking for because she had spent 3 years watching similar patterns in a completely different context. Not on cardiac monitors in ICU rooms. On field equipment in situations where a man's decision to regulate his own breathing and heart rate was the difference between being found and not being found. Harlan Vespry's cardiac variability pattern was not random. It was not the chaotic noise of an unconscious brain struggling to maintain homeostasis. It was measured. It had internal logic. It shifted in cycles that matched no physiological unconsciousness model Sarah had ever studied. It matched something else. She was still standing there when the door to ICU 4 opened from inside and the remaining suit leaned his head out. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was flat in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. "Just monitoring the hallway," Sarah said. "Night shift." He looked at her for a moment, then withdrew and closed the door. Sarah walked back to the nurse's station and sat down at the computer. She opened the hospital's patient access system and pulled up the chart for Harlan Vespry, which she technically had access to as a registered nursing staff member of Halverton General, though it was a stretch of her assignment tonight. She read the attending notes, the radiologist's findings, the preliminary neurological assessment. The documentation was thorough. The conclusions were consistent. Every professional who had examined Harlan Vespry had reached the same outcome. Severe traumatic brain injury, persistent vegetative state, prognosis poor to none. Sarah read it twice. Then she looked at the HRV data in the monitoring logs and compared it to the clinical notes. Nobody had mentioned the variability pattern. Not once. Not as a footnote, not as an anomaly to be explained away, not as anything. It was in the raw data, accessible to anyone who looked at the monitoring logs directly. And nobody had looked. At 2:08 a.m., something happened that changed the nature of everything. A man arrived at the ICU floor who had not been there before. He came from the elevator rather than the main corridor, which was unusual at this hour. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of unremarkable face that seemed professionally engineered to be forgotten, and he wore a dark suit that was slightly too expensive for a hospital administrator. He showed something to the remaining suit outside ICU 4, a badge of some kind briefly displayed, and was admitted to the room without question. Sarah watched from the nurse's station, positioned so she appeared to be looking at her computer screen. The man was inside for 9 minutes. When he came out, he walked back to the elevator without speaking to anyone. The suit by the door had his phone out again and appeared to be sending a message. Sarah opened the monitoring log on her computer and pulled the real-time cardiac data for ICU 4. The HRV pattern had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would flag an alarm or prompt an automatic nurse response. But the micro-variation cycles had shifted in timing, and there was a brief suppression event at 2:11 a.m. that lasted 40 seconds and then resolved. It was the kind of thing you'd see in a patient who had experienced a stimulus, sound, touch, emotional response, and whose autonomic system had reacted before returning to its suppressed baseline. Sarah sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to ICU 4. The suit at the door straightened slightly as she approached. "I need to check the patient's vitals," she said. "Routine monitoring. It'll take 5 minutes. The patient has nursing staff assigned. The assigned nurse went on break 20 minutes ago. I'm covering." This was true. She had checked. He looked at her. She looked back with the calm patience of someone who has been looked at by people far more trained to intimidate than a man in a good suit standing in a hospital hallway. He stepped aside. Inside, Harlan Vespry lay exactly as before. Same position, same ventilator rhythm, same exterior stillness. Sarah moved to the monitoring station on the right side of the bed and began running a standard vital check, making notes, doing everything exactly as she would for any patient in any room. She was close enough to observe the cardiac readout directly now, without the distortion of a window. The pattern was clearer and more unmistakable than it had been from the hallway. The R to R variations were precise, consistent, controlled. She turned slightly and looked at Harlan Vespry's face. His eyes were closed. His expression was neutral in the particular way of a face that had been trained to show nothing. The oxygen saturation was good. The blood pressure was stable. "Admiral Vespry," Sarah said quietly, in the tone she used for unconscious patients, matter of fact, not dramatic, simply present. Nothing happened. She had expected nothing to happen. She looked at the cardiac monitor. The variability pattern held steady for 3 seconds after she'd spoken his name. Then, a single brief compression in the cycle, barely detectable, the kind of thing that happened constantly in cardiac data and meant nothing on its own, except that it happened precisely at the 3-second mark. Not randomly, not as a noise artifact, with the timing of a response. Sarah finished her vital check. She made her notes. She thanked the suit at the door on her way out, which was a thing she did reflexively and which he clearly had not expected. In the corridor, she walked to the far end, past the range of the hallway cameras, and stood by the window that looked out over the parking structure. She was breathing evenly. Her hands were steady. But inside, behind the careful stillness she'd learned to maintain in situations where stillness was operationally necessary, something had shifted. She had done this before. The process of recognizing what something actually was beneath what it appeared to be, and then deciding what to do with that knowledge. It was not a comfortable process. It came with weight and risk, and the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who sees something no one else is looking for. At 3:17 a.m., she went back to her charting. She filed the vital check notes from ICU 4, documented accurately and thoroughly, with no editorializing. She added a separate clinical observation note about the HRV pattern, citing the specific data points, the timing of the anomaly during the 2:08 a.m. visitor's presence, and the response observation at 3:04 a.m. She flagged it for attending physician review and submitted it through the hospital's standard medical concern pathway. It would, under normal circumstances, land in Preston Morrow's queue. She didn't have particularly high hopes for that route. At 4:45 a.m., Cassie Drummond found her in the break room. "I heard you went into Vespry's room," Cassie said. She looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they've been asked to carry a message they don't entirely agree with. "Sarah, Morrow's going to know by morning. Someone already told the suits about the monitoring check. I had coverage responsibility. It was a legitimate check." That's not what I mean." Cassie sat down across from her. She was 26, still in that phase of hospital work where she believed that not making waves was a reasonable professional strategy. Sarah remembered being that age. She had run out of patience for it under conditions considerably more dangerous than a hospital night shift. "The man they brought in, there's something happening around his case that isn't normal. The people with him aren't hospital liaison. I don't know who they are, but they've been giving orders to the attending, and the attending has been taking them." Sarah looked at her. "Preston Morrow has been taking orders from men in suits?" Cassie hesitated. "Suggestions, professionally worded suggestions. About the patient's care, about the patient's status, his classification, what gets documented." Sarah set down her coffee. "Cassie, what are they suggesting gets documented?" Cassie was quiet for a moment. Then, "That his condition is terminal, that further intervention isn't indicated, that the appropriate next step is transfer to a long-term federal care facility in," she paused, "in 48 hours. The room was very quiet. Sarah thought about the HRV pattern. She thought about the 9-minute visit at 2:08 a.m. She thought about the brief suppression event at 2:11 and the response at 3:04 and the specific timing of both. "Where's the transfer order coming from?" she asked. "It came through as a Pentagon liaison request. Medical transport is already arranged." Cassie leaned forward slightly. Sarah, please don't do anything that gets you fired. You've only been here 7 months. Sarah picked up her coffee again. I appreciate the warning, she said. And she meant it, in the complicated way she meant most things. The sun was coming up behind the mountains when she ended her shift at 7 a.m. She drove home, which took 11 minutes, and she sat in her car in the driveway for 3 minutes before going inside. Her apartment was small and deliberately bare, not because she couldn't afford better, but because she had learned not to accumulate things she might need to leave behind quickly, and some habits were harder to unlearn than others. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything she had observed, in order, with times. It took 40 minutes. She reviewed it once, made 2 corrections, then folded the pages and put them in an envelope that went into the drawer under her kitchen counter. Then she opened her laptop and began making inquiries through 3 channels that had nothing to do with Halverton General Hospital. The transfer was in 48 hours. She had a patient who could not speak, who could not move, who was surrounded by people working to ensure he disappeared quietly into a federal facility where asking questions would be considerably harder. And she had seen that cardiac pattern before. She had seen it on a man who was choosing, deliberately, to appear dead. She showered, set her alarm for noon, and tried to sleep. She did not sleep. At 9:22 a.m., her phone rang. The caller ID read, Halverton General Administration. She answered, Ms. Voss. The voice was administrative and careful. This is Patricia Helm, nursing supervisor. I'm calling to let you know that effective immediately, your assignment has been changed. You've been moved to the East Wing, general floor, day rotation. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I'm currently on night ICU rotation. Yes, Dr. Morrow has requested a staffing change, effective today's shift. Did he give a reason? A pause. Staffing needs, Helm said, in the tone of someone reading from a script they hadn't written. Sarah looked at the ceiling of her bedroom. Outside, a bird was making a very loud and uncomplicated argument about something. Understood, she said. I'll report for the new assignment. She hung up. Then she picked up a second phone, a different one, older, that she kept in the drawer of her nightstand, and sent a message to a number she hadn't used in 14 months. Something is happening. I need a verification channel. She waited. The reply came in 4 minutes. Standing by. Send what you have. Sarah looked at the envelope on her kitchen counter for a long moment. Then she went to get it. In ICU 4, 11 minutes later, the cardiac monitor that no one had asked Sarah to check anymore continued to record the same precise, controlled, impossible pattern. The heartbeat of a man who was supposed to be gone, who could not speak, who could not move, and who had been listening to everything from the moment they brought him through the door. The envelope sat on the passenger seat of Sarah's car for the entire drive back to Halverton General, which was not where she was supposed to be going at 10:30 in the morning after a full night shift, but the word 48 hours had lodged itself somewhere behind her sternum, and she couldn't dislodge it by sitting in her apartment staring at the ceiling. She didn't go through the main entrance. She parked in the staff lot on the east side, used her badge on the side door that the overnight custodial team always propped slightly open while they moved equipment, and went up the back stairwell to the second floor. She wasn't doing anything that technically violated hospital policy. She was on staff. She had building access. She was simply visiting on her off hours, which nurses did occasionally, and the fact that she was doing it in the specific direction of the ICU wing was nobody's concern but hers. The hallway outside ICU 4 had changed. There were now 2 suits where there had been one, and a third man Sarah hadn't seen before. Older, with the posture of someone who'd spent decades in uniform and carried the habit of it into civilian clothes, was standing near the nursing station talking in a low voice to the ward clerk, who looked like she wanted to be somewhere else. The ward clerk's name was Louisa, and she was 53 years old and had worked at Halverton General for 19 years and was not, under normal circumstances, intimidated by anyone. She looked intimidated now. Sarah went the other direction. She found Cassie Drummond coming out of a supply room on the north side of the floor, arms full of IV bags, and fell into step beside her. "Walk with me," Sarah said. Cassie looked at her sideways. "You're not supposed to be here." "I'm a hospital employee visiting the building," Keep walking. They moved together down the corridor. Cassie's arms were full enough that she had a reasonable excuse to be walking fast and looking at the floor, which suited Sarah fine. The transfer order, Sarah said quietly. When was it formalized? This morning, around 8. Who signed it? Cassie hesitated. Morrow countersigned, but the originating physician of record is someone named Dr. Ellard Foss. I don't know him. He's not on staff here. Where's he from? The paperwork lists him as a consulting neurologist, affiliated with a federal medical contractor. Another hesitation. Sarah, the men downstairs, they've been in Morrow's office twice this morning. The second time they were in there for 40 minutes. Sarah processed this without showing it. Is there a patient advocate assigned to Vespri's case? He arrived without family contact. There's no next of kin on file. The military listed a liaison officer as the emergency contact, but that liaison officer is... Cassie stopped walking for a half second, then resumed. The liaison officer is one of the suits in the hallway. Sarah stopped at the corner and turned to face her. Cassie, I need you to do something. I was afraid of that. I need you to pull the raw monitoring data from last night, not the summarized readout, the raw feed, and save it to a removable drive before anyone decides to archive or overwrite it. The hospital keeps uncompressed monitoring data for 72 hours before it goes to long-term storage. I need a copy of last night's feed from ICU 4, specifically from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Cassie stared at her. That's a patient privacy. I'm a registered nurse who performed a documented vital check on that patient during that window. I have legitimate access to the monitoring data from that check. Sarah kept her voice level. I'm not asking you to do anything that doesn't have a defensible basis. I'm asking you to do it before the data gets administratively buried. Cassie looked down at the IV bags in her arms, then up, then at a point somewhere past Sarah's shoulder. Give me 2 hours, she said. Sarah left through the east stairwell. She sat in her car and thought about Dr. Ellard Foss and a federal medical contractor that didn't appear in any public directory she'd found in the 20 minutes she'd spent searching before driving back here. She thought about a transfer order that had been arranged before Harlan Vespri had been in the building for 12 hours, which meant it had been arranged before any responsible physician could have completed a thorough neurological workup, which meant someone had decided on the outcome before examining the evidence, which was not how medicine worked when medicine was being practiced honestly. She thought about the 9-minute visit at 2:08 a.m. and the 2:11 suppression event. Then she picked up the older phone and sent another message. I need a background search. Ellard Foss, neurologist, federal medical contractor affiliation. Transfer order for a patient at Halverton General, Dunmore, CO. 48-hour timeline. She waited. On it. Sit tight. She did not sit tight. She drove to a diner on Marchfield Avenue that she'd eaten at exactly twice since moving to Dunmore 7 months ago, ordered coffee and eggs she didn't particularly want, and spent 90 minutes at a corner table making notes on a paper napkin that she then folded into her pocket. When she got back to her car, the older phone had 2 messages. The first, Foss. License valid, minimal public record, affiliated with a contractor called Viridian Medical Consulting. DoD contracts, classified scope, clients undisclosed. The second, the transfer destination isn't a federal care facility. It's listed as one on the paperwork, but the address routes to a DoD-adjacent holding site in rural Nevada. Not a hospital. Sarah read the messages twice. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket and drove. She was back at Halverton General by 1:15 p.m., this time through the main entrance and in the direction of the administrative offices, which were on the ground floor and which smelled of recycled air and institutional carpet. The receptionist outside the nursing supervisor's office looked up with the particular expression of a person who has been told to expect someone and is not pleased to be part of whatever is happening. Ms. Voss, Patricia Helms said from the doorway of her own office, I didn't expect to see you in person. I wanted to discuss my reassignment, Sarah said. Do you have a few minutes? Helms' office was small and organized with the precision of someone who used order as a stress management strategy. She sat behind her desk and folded her hands and looked at Sarah with the expression of a woman who had navigated 17 years of hospital administration by being exactly as helpful as she needed to be and not 1 degree more. The reassignment is effective today, Helm said. I understand it's an inconvenience. I filed a clinical observation note last night through the standard medical concern pathway, Sarah said, flagged for attending physician review. I'd like to confirm it was received. A pause. Clinical notes are processed through. I know how they're processed. I'd like to know if this specific one was received and whether it generated any response. Helm's hands, still folded, tightened fractionally. I'm not in a position to track individual clinical notes, Ms. Voss. Is there someone who is? The attending physician of record would receive flagged notes directly. So Dr. Morrow? Yes. Sarah looked at her for a moment. Patricia Helm was not a bad person. Sarah had developed a reasonable instinct for the difference between people who were complicit and people who were adjacent, and Helm read as the latter. A woman who knew something was off-register, but had made the calculation that not knowing the details protected her professionally. It was a rational choice. Sarah had made the opposite one, which was also a choice she had made before. Thank you, Sarah said. She stood up. I'll report for the East Wing assignment this evening. She left Helm's office and took the elevator to the second floor. She was not supposed to be on the second floor, in the sense that her assignment no longer included the ICU wing, but she was a hospital employee and the elevator went where it went. Preston Morrow's office was at the end of the second floor administrative corridor, tucked behind the surgical scheduling suite. His door was closed. The light under it was on. Sarah could hear faintly the sound of a phone call. His voice, low in a cadence that wasn't his normal departmental authority register. This was something smaller, more careful. She knocked. The voice stopped. A 5-second pause. Then, "Come in." Morrow was behind his desk with his phone face down on the surface in front of him. He was 61 and looked, in that moment, somewhere older. There was a quality to his posture that Sarah hadn't seen before. Not the aggressive certainty of a department chief in his own domain, but something more like a man sitting very still because moving might draw attention to how uncomfortable he was. "Ms. Voss," he said, "your shift change should have been communicated." It was. "I'm here about my clinical observation note." Sarah sat down without being invited to, which she could see registered on his face. "I submitted it at 3:22 a.m. through the standard pathway. I'd like to discuss the findings." "There's nothing to discuss. The patient has been assessed. The patient's HRV data shows a pattern inconsistent with vegetative state," Sarah said. She kept her voice even and her hands relaxed on her knees, which took some effort. Specifically, the R2R interval variations follow a non-random cycle that correlates with external stimuli, including a visitor who arrived at 2:08 a.m. There was a suppression event at 2:11 and a measurable response at 3:04. None of this appears in any clinical documentation. Morrow looked at her. His expression had done something complicated in the last 10 seconds and was still working through it. "I reviewed the monitoring data," he said. "The variations you're describing are within expected parameters for—" "They're not," Sarah said. "Not aggressively, just flatly. They're not within any neurological parameter for a vegetative patient, and I think you know that." The room was quiet. Something moved behind Morrow's eyes that Sarah filed away and didn't comment on. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was the look of a man who had told himself a particular story often enough that he almost believed it, being confronted with someone who didn't. "The transfer is scheduled," he said. "The decision has been made by physicians with the appropriate credentials and clearance." "Ellard Foss isn't credentialed in Colorado," Sarah said. "I checked. His license is registered in Virginia, and he's never held active privileges at any Colorado facility. That makes his co-signature on a care directive in this state legally—" "I'd recommend," Morrow said, and his voice had shifted now, back to the familiar register of authority, but with something underneath it that wasn't authority at all. "That you take your reassignment and let this proceed. You've been here 7 months. You have no idea what you're walking into." Sarah looked at him. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," she said. She left. In the elevator, she held the handrail and breathed slowly and thought about Morrow's face when she'd mentioned Foss's credentials. He'd known, not known in the sense of having looked it up, known in the pre-existing sense. The information hadn't surprised him. It had reminded him of something he was working to keep in a different room of his mind. She called Cassie from the parking lot. "Do you have it?" "I have it." Cassie's voice was tight. "Sarah, when I pulled the raw feed, I noticed something. Someone accessed the monitoring archive for ICU 4 this morning at 7:48 a.m., before my shift started. It wasn't nursing staff. The access log shows a credential I don't recognize, administrative level access." "Did they copy it or delete it?" "I don't know. I couldn't tell from the log, but the timestamp is 7:48 and the transfer order was filed at 8:03. 15 minutes apart. "Get me that drive," Sarah said. "Don't bring it to the hospital. I'll meet you at the Marchfield Diner at 4. She hung up. The afternoon was cold and clear in the way of Colorado spring afternoons, when the sky goes a hard, specific blue and the mountains look so close you could reach them in 20 minutes, which was never true. Sarah sat in her car with the heater running and thought about timelines. 48 hours from the transfer order filed at 8:03 a.m. meant Harlan Vespri would be in a vehicle headed to a DOD-adjacent facility in Nevada by 8:03 a.m. the day after tomorrow. Once he was in that vehicle, whatever Sarah had documented, whatever was on that monitoring drive, whatever she could demonstrate about the pattern she'd observed, none of it would matter in any practical sense. A man who disappeared into a facility with no public record and no accessible patient advocate was functionally gone, and the question of whether he was actually conscious would become academic. She had, by her calculation, roughly 32 hours. She thought about what she had. A stack of documented observations she'd filed through the standard pathway, which had gone tomorrow, which had gone nowhere. Raw monitoring data on a drive that a second-year nurse was going to hand her at a diner. A background check from an unofficial source on a physician with a questionable license, and a theory about a cardiac pattern that every credentialed physician who'd reviewed the case had either missed or chosen not to mention. None of it would move Preston Morrow. She'd already tested that. She needed it to move someone else. She picked up the older phone and typed a longer message than she'd sent before. 2 paragraphs, specific, clinical, with the data points attached as a text summary. She sent it and then stared at the phone for 3 minutes. The reply came back in 40 seconds. "This is a federal matter. You understand what that means?" "Yes," she typed back. "You also understand that your record, the parts of it that are relevant here, is going to surface when this does." She'd thought about that. She'd been thinking about it in one form or another since 3 a.m. It was the thing she'd been carrying in the back of the drive back here, the thing underneath the envelope on the passenger seat, the reason she'd sat in her car for 3 minutes before going inside her apartment. She had spent 4 years making sure that the relevant parts of her record stayed in the relevant rooms. She had taken a job in a mid-sized Colorado city at a mid-sized hospital, specifically because it was the kind of place where people didn't ask about the gaps in a resume if you were competent and reliable and didn't cause trouble. She had apparently run out of runway on that last part. "I understand," she typed. "Give us 12 hours. She put the phone in her pocket and drove to the diner. Cassie was already there when she arrived, sitting in a booth by the window with her coat still on and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She put a small drive on the table between them when Sarah sat down, and Sarah pocketed it without looking at it. "Are you going to tell me what's actually happening?" Cassie asked. Sarah considered how much truth was useful here. "The man in ICU 4 is conscious," she said. "I believe he's been conscious since they brought him in. Someone knows that and doesn't want it established on record before he's transferred." Cassie stared at her. I know. If he's conscious, then everything being done to him is, I know." Cassie picked up her coffee and put it down without drinking. "Why would anyone, he's an admiral. He's military. Who has the leverage to, I don't know all of it yet." Sarah watched a family at the counter. A man paying, 2 kids arguing about something, a woman who'd stopped listening to both and was looking at her phone with the distant expression of someone who'd had a very long Tuesday. "But I know that the transfer destination isn't what the paperwork says it is, and I know that the physician who filed the primary care directive doesn't have valid credentials in this state." "So what are you going to do?" Sarah looked at her. "What I'm supposed to do." Cassie opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at the table for a moment. Morrow knows, doesn't he, that you came to see him? Yes. Then by tonight, the men upstairs will know too. Probably. And you're still... Cassie stopped. Started again. You're here 7 months. Nobody knows much about you, but Morrow said something this afternoon to one of the other attendings. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but the door was open. He said you were a problem because you had the kind of background that made people think their concerns mattered. Sarah was quiet for a moment. He's not wrong about the background. Cassie looked at her steadily. What kind of background is it? The kind, Sarah said, that knows what a man looks like when he's choosing to appear dead. She left $30 on the table for a $12 coffee and walked out. The evening shift change at Halverton General happened at 7 p.m. Sarah arrived at 6:45 and checked in for the East Wing assignment. 3rd floor general, 4 patients, routine monitoring. She put her bag in the locker room, changed into her scrubs, and spent the first 90 minutes of her shift doing exactly what was expected of her, which was straightforward enough. At 9:14 p.m., her work phone buzzed with a message from a Halverton General internal number. It was from Morrow's administrative assistant. Dr. Morrow has requested that your medical concern submission from last night be formally closed. Please confirm receipt of this notification. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. She typed, Confirmed receipt. I do not consent to closure. The concerns remain active, and I am formally requesting escalation to the hospital's patient safety officer. She sent it, put the phone back in her pocket, and went to check on the patient in 312 who'd been asking for an extra blanket since 7:30. The patient in 312 was named Walter Drum, 78 years old, post-cardiac procedure, with the particular quality of alertness that some older patients had at night, the sense of having slept through enough days to know that nights mattered more. He was watching a documentary about deep-sea fish on a small television mounted above his bed, and he lowered the volume when Sarah came in. You're not the usual one, he said. New assignment. Is 1 blanket enough, or did you want 2? 2? He watched her pull the second blanket from the warmer and spread it over him. You look like you're working through something. I'm fine. You look fine. He said it kindly. You also look like you're carrying something heavy and pretending it's not there. My wife used to do that. Worst habit she had. Spent 20 years insisting she was fine until one day she was actually not fine, and by then the habit was too deep. Sarah smoothed the edge of the blanket. What happened? She's all right. Had a scare that turned out to be less than we feared. But the lesson was the lesson. He gestured at the television. Sit down for a minute. Nobody's watching. I have other patients. I know. Sit down anyway. Sarah looked at the chair beside his bed and thought about Cassie's face across the diner table and Morrow's voice that morning. You have no idea what you're walking into. And the family at the counter in the diner, so ordinary and unaware of anything except their own Tuesday. She sat down. 3 more minutes, she said. He nodded at the television. Did you know that certain deep-sea fish can generate their own light? They don't wait for the sun. It's completely dark down there. No light ever reaches, not even a fraction. And they just make their own. I did know that, actually. Then you know it's a choice, in the biological sense. They evolved toward it because the alternative was being permanently invisible. He settled back against his pillows. I always thought there was something instructive in that. Sarah thought about a man lying still in a room upstairs, hearing everything, waiting. Get some sleep, Mr. Drum, she said, and stood up. 2 more minutes, he said, but gently, already closing his eyes. She went back to the hallway. At 11:47 p.m., her personal phone rang. The older one. She stepped into the stairwell to answer it. The transfer, said the voice on the other end. Male, measured, with the flat regional absence of someone who'd spent years in institutional environments. Has been moved up. They're not waiting 48 hours. Sarah went still. How long? The vehicle is scheduled for 6 a.m. Someone accessed the monitoring archive this morning and found a secondary copy they didn't know existed. They know someone has the raw data and they're moving before it can be formalized into a federal submission. 6 a.m. It was 11:47. That was 6 hours and 13 minutes. What do you need from me? She asked. Keep him in that building, the voice said. Whatever you can do legally and within your authority as medical staff. Delay, document, create procedural friction. We need 4 hours. 4 hours for what? A pause. For what happens next? The line went dead. Sarah stood in the stairwell with the phone in her hand and the concrete walls cold around her, and the sound of the building's ventilation system running its steady, indifferent breath. 4 hours. She had a general floor assignment on the 3rd level and 0 legitimate authority over a patient in the ICU on the 2nd level who was scheduled to be transferred by an order she had protested once and been told to close. She thought about what she had. She had a formal escalation request to the patient safety officer filed 40 minutes ago, which under hospital policy required acknowledgement within 2 hours and a preliminary review within 12, a timeline that, if enforced, would create a procedural obstruction to any care decision pending safety review. She had a clinical observation on file documenting specific data points that had not been addressed by the attending physician of record, which under state nursing board guidelines constituted an unresolved medical concern that could be cited in any legal challenge to a care decision. She had a drive in her locker with 9 hours of raw monitoring data that showed something every documented clinical assessment had missed or chosen not to report. And she had the specific documented fact that the co-signing physician on the transfer order held no valid credentials in Colorado, which made the order, on its face, procedurally irregular. None of these things, individually, stopped a vehicle from arriving at 6 a.m. Together, if she moved them fast enough and into the right channels simultaneously, they created a procedural environment in which executing the transfer became complicated. Not impossible, but complicated enough that the people arranging it would have to make a choice between speed and clean paperwork. And people who were arranging things quietly preferred clean paperwork. She went back to the 3rd floor nursing station, sat down at the computer, and started typing. She filed a formal medical irregularity report citing Foss's credential status, directed to the hospital's legal compliance officer with a timestamp and case number. She filed a second report to the Colorado State Nursing Board's online reporting portal, citing the unresolved clinical observation and the attempted administrative closure. She composed a detailed written request for emergency patient safety review, citing imminent transfer, unresolved medical concerns, and documentation of a care decision by a physician without active state licensure, and she sent it to the patient safety officer, the chief nursing officer, and the hospital's general counsel simultaneously. She was 40 minutes into this when her work phone rang. Ms. Voss. It was a voice she didn't recognize, calm, male, with the specific quality of someone who chose calmness deliberately. This is Raymond Holt, hospital security. I need to ask you to come to the security office. Sarah finished the sentence she was typing before answering. Is there a problem? There's a concern we'd like to discuss in person. I'm in the middle of patient documentation. Is it urgent? A brief pause. Yes. She saved the document, confirmed the submission she'd already sent, and locked the screen. The security office was on the ground floor, past the main reception area, in a part of the building that always smelled slightly of the parking structure below it. Raymond Holt was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s who had the look of someone who'd spent his career dealing with problems that were mostly administrative and was not enjoying the current problem, which was clearly not administrative. Standing beside him, which Sarah noted immediately, was the older man she'd seen outside ICU 4 that morning, the one with the ex-military posture and civilian clothes. Ms. Voss, Holt said, this is— I know who he's with, Sarah said. She sat down across from the desk without being asked and set her hands on her knees and looked at the other man steadily. And I know what this is about. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He sat down too. You filed 4 reports in the last hour, he said. 3, Sarah said. The 4th is still processing. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. You're going to cause significant procedural complications for an operation that has federal authorization. I'm going to cause procedural complications for a transfer order signed by a physician without Colorado licensure, Sarah said. That's not a federal authorization question. That's a state medical practice question, and I've already submitted it to the people who handle that. The patient is a federal subject. The patient is a human being in a Colorado hospital receiving medical care that I have documented clinical concerns about. She kept her voice even. Under state law, I am obligated to report unresolved clinical concerns. I've done that. If that creates procedural complications, that's a consequence of the documentation, not of my decision to create complications. The room was very quiet. The man looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, not on hospital administrators, not on physicians, but on people who operated in environments where information was assessed quickly and decisions made faster. He was evaluating something, not her argument. He'd already processed her argument, something else. Your record, he said finally. What about it? The parts of it that aren't public. Sarah held his gaze. If you're suggesting that my personal history should affect how my clinical documentation is treated, that's a conversation I'd recommend having with the state nursing board, not with me in a security office at midnight. He was quiet for another 3 seconds. Then he stood up, which was its own kind of answer, and left the room without another word. Holt looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Holt. Am I free to go back to my patients? She asked. Yeah, he said. He sounded tired. Yeah, go ahead. She went back upstairs. At 1:08 a.m., she was at the nursing station when a sound came from the ICU corridor. Not an alarm, not a voice, but the particular quality of multiple footsteps moving with purpose, which in a hospital at this hour meant something had changed. She stood up. Down the hall outside ICU 4, both suits were on their phones simultaneously. The door to the room was open, and through it Sarah could see movement. Not nursing staff movement, the efficient and practiced economy of people who knew the room, but something less familiar. Someone was doing something with the monitoring equipment. She walked toward it. One of the suits stepped into her path. Staff only beyond this point. I'm staff, Sarah said. Not for this patient. She stopped 3 feet from him. Through the open door, she could see a man in dark clothes disconnecting the secondary cardiac lead. Not the primary, not in a way that would trigger the floor alarm, but the secondary lead that fed the monitoring archive. The one that had generated the raw data on the drive in her locker. You need to stop, she said clearly, loudly enough for her voice to carry into the room. The suit in front of her moved to block her view. Ms. Voss, there is an active patient safety review on that patient, Sarah said at the same volume. Any alteration of monitoring equipment during an active safety review is a reportable violation under Colorado State Health Code. I am reporting it now, verbally, to everyone in this hallway, and I will be documenting it in writing in the next 5 minutes. The man in the room had stopped moving. The suits in the hallway were very still. From inside ICU 4, in the particular quiet that followed, there was a sound that had no clinical explanation. A sound too small and too brief to mean anything definitive, except that Sarah heard it, and she knew what it was, because she'd heard it before in a completely different world, from men who had been lying still in impossible circumstances for reasons nobody else understood. A single, controlled exhale. Deliberate. Measured. The kind that took practice. The kind that said, I hear you. Nobody in the hallway moved for 3 full seconds. The exhale had been real. Sarah knew what real sounded like, and she knew what manufactured ambiguity looked like. The moment when a room full of people collectively decided whether to acknowledge something or pretend it hadn't happened. The suit nearest the door was doing the math behind his eyes. The man inside the room, the one who'd been disconnecting the monitoring lead, had gone completely still with his hands 6 inches from the equipment. Sarah spoke first, because she had learned a long time ago that the person who defines the moment usually controls what comes next. I need everyone who is not licensed medical staff to step back from that patient, she said. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. What just happened is a clinical event. It needs to be documented and assessed. Right now. The suit in the doorway said, that was a ventilator artifact. You're not a clinician. Sarah moved forward, not fast, not aggressive, just with the steady directional purpose that she'd developed in environments where hesitation got people killed. Step back. He stepped back. Whether it was her tone or something else, she didn't analyze it. She went through the door. The man in the dark clothes had moved away from the monitoring equipment. She logged that without looking at him directly. Her attention went to the patient, to the monitors, to the data in front of her. Harlan Vespri's eyes were still closed. His expression was still neutral. The ventilator was cycling. The primary cardiac readout showed the same controlled pattern it had shown all night. But the secondary monitoring lead, the one the man had been in the process of disconnecting, was still attached. The data was still recording, and the HRV pattern had changed. It was more active than it had been at any point since Sarah had first observed it. The R to R variations were faster, slightly less controlled, as if something underneath the deliberate regulation had slipped a fraction. Not a loss of control, but an adjustment. A response to elevated stimulus. The autonomic system of a man who was awake, aware, and had just heard something that mattered. Sarah picked up the room's secondary tablet, the one that accessed the local monitoring interface, and took a screenshot of the current readout. Then another. Then she documented the time, the current values, and a brief clinical description, and she filed it immediately through the hospital's incident reporting system, because an incident had occurred and it was now on record regardless of what happened to the original observation note. She turned around. The man in dark clothes was gone. She hadn't heard him leave, which told her something about his training that she filed away. The two suits were still in the doorway, both on phones now, voices low. The older man, the one from the security office, was not among them, which meant he was somewhere else making a decision she didn't have visibility on. She had bought time. She didn't know exactly how much. She went back to the nursing station and called the patient safety officer's emergency line, which was a number that existed for situations exactly like this one, and which, at 1:24 in the morning, rang 6 times before a man answered with the groggy authority of someone trying to sound less asleep than he was. This is Nolan Aberth. Mr. Aberth, this is Sarah Voss, RN, Halverton General Night Staff. I submitted a formal patient safety escalation approximately 90 minutes ago regarding the patient in ICU 4. I'm calling to advise that there has been a subsequent incident, an attempt by non-clinical personnel to remove monitoring equipment from that patient during an active safety review. I filed an incident report with timestamp. I need to know whether the safety review creates an automatic procedural hold on any care or transfer decisions. A pause. The sound of someone becoming more awake. What's the patient's name? Vespri. Harlan Vespri. The escalation should be in your queue. Another pause. Longer. She could hear him at a keyboard. I have it. His voice was different now. Less groggy, more careful. Ms. Voss, what you're describing, a safety review does create a procedural flag, but it doesn't automatically halt a transfer unless there's a direct clinical finding that contradicts the care decision. The flag needs to be supported by physician assessment. The clinical finding is in the submission. HRV pattern inconsistent with vegetative state diagnosis, time-stamped observations, correlation with external stimuli, and a responsive event at 1:22 a.m. Responsive. The patient produced an audible, controlled exhale in response to a verbal statement. It was witnessed by multiple people in the hallway. I've documented it. The silence on the line was the specific silence of a man recalculating. I need to make some calls, Aberth said. Do not let anyone move that patient until I get back to you. The transfer is scheduled for 6 a.m. I heard you. Don't let anyone move him. The line went dead. Sarah put the phone down and looked at the clock. 1:31 a.m., 4.5 hours. She thought about what she'd said to Aberth. Do not let anyone move that patient, and the gap between what she could say and what she could actually enforce. She was a third-floor general nurse on a reassigned shift. Her authority over ICU 4 was exactly what she'd been creating through documentation and formal channels, which was to say, procedural, fragile, and entirely dependent on people in offices picking up phones at 1:30 in the morning and making decisions that put them in someone's crosshairs. She went back to the ICU corridor anyway. The two suits were still there. The door to ICU 4 was closed now. Through the window, Sarah could see the monitoring equipment was intact. All leads connected, all readouts running. Whatever the man in dark clothes had been attempting hadn't been completed. She didn't know whether that was because of her intervention or because he'd gotten what he actually came for, which might have been something smaller and less visible than a disconnected lead. She stood at the window and watched the cardiac readout. The HRV pattern was still elevated relative to its earlier baseline, still controlled, still precise, but with that additional layer of activity that hadn't been there before. She watched it for 2 minutes, timing the variations, and then she did something she hadn't done before. She put her hand flat on the window glass. It was a ridiculous gesture. He couldn't see it. The room was dark except for the monitor glow and the low safety lighting, and he was facing the ceiling with his eyes closed. But she did it anyway, because some things were about the doing and not the outcome. The cardiac pattern held steady for 4 beats. Then there was a single micro-compression in the cycle. Brief, precise, gone. She took her hand off the glass. At 2:19 a.m., everything accelerated. She heard them before she saw them. Not because they were loud, but because a hospital at 2 a.m. has a particular acoustic texture, and 4 additional people moving through it with purpose disrupted that texture in a way that reached her from 50 feet away. She came around the corner from the nursing station and saw them coming from the elevator, 2 in civilian clothes she didn't recognize, and behind them, in military uniform, a woman with the posture of someone who had stopped apologizing for how much space she took up sometime around her mid-career. The woman was perhaps 55, lean in the way of sustained physical discipline rather than accident, with silver hair cut efficiently short and the particular expression of someone who had read a briefing in a vehicle and arrived ready to act on it. Her uniform carried the insignia of the Army Medical Corps, and she was moving like someone who knew where she was going before she got there. She stopped when she saw Sarah, which was not what Sarah had expected. "Nurse Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. Sarah went still. "Yes." "Colonel Marin Stout, Army Medical Corps. I need you to show me the monitoring data." Behind Stout, the 2 civilian men had already turned toward ICU 4 and were showing credentials to the suits in the hallway. Sarah watched the suits look at those credentials for a long moment, then step aside, which was the first time either of them had stepped aside for anyone who wasn't already on their approved list. "The raw data is on a drive," Sarah said. "The incident documentation is in the hospital's safety reporting system. I can also pull up the current readout. There was an escalation in HR5 activity at 1:22 a.m. following a responsive event. Walk with me," Stout said, and she was already moving. They went into ICU 4 together. The 2 civilian men were already in the room, one of them at the monitoring station and one near the bed, and Sarah watched the one near the bed lean close to Harlan Vespri and say something quiet and specific that she was too far away to catch. What she wasn't too far away to see was the cardiac readout's immediate response. The HRV pattern spiked, not dangerously, not in a way that would alarm anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, but dramatically relative to its previous baseline. The micro-variations accelerated, the cycles compressed slightly, and then, with what looked to Sarah like a deliberate, effortful act of self-regulation, the pattern began to slow back down toward baseline, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and had just been told he could exhale. Colonel Stout was looking at the monitor. "How long have you been tracking this pattern?" "Since approximately midnight last night," Sarah said. "First observation was through the window. I performed a documented vital check at 3 a.m. and added the clinical observation to the formal pathway. The data goes back to admission. And you identified it as volitional HRV regulation." "I identified it as inconsistent with vegetative state diagnosis, with characteristics consistent with deliberate autonomic self-regulation. I don't have the authority to diagnose." "No, but you have the eyes for it." Stout turned to look at her. "You were medic trained." It wasn't a question either. "Yes," Sarah said. "Where?" 3 years forward support, 2 tours. She paused. "I know what it looks like when someone's hiding." Something moved briefly in Stout's expression. Recognition, maybe, or the professional equivalent of 2 people realizing they've been reading the same manual. The facility explosion 2 nights ago, the one that preceded his admission, was not an accident. She kept her voice low. "We've been tracking a potential internal compromise for 4 months. Vespri was the senior officer with direct access to the classified program documentation. When the explosion happened, we lost communication with him and were told he'd sustained critical neurological damage." Someone used his injury as cover to silence him, Sarah said. Someone used his injury to buy time. Stout's eyes moved back to the monitor. However long it took to locate and destroy the documentation he was carrying. And the transfer? The transfer destination is a holding facility with no public oversight. Patients who arrive there in vegetative state do not historically improve. She said it without inflection, which was its own kind of statement. We had 48 hours to locate him, and we had 31 left when your escalation report started coming through the Federal Medical Review Channel at 11 p.m. Sarah absorbed this. The patient safety officer's number connects to a federal channel? When the patient is flagged as military, yes. A thin pause. Your reports created a procedural audit trail. They couldn't move him without generating documented violations that would have required explanation. You bought us the time we needed. From the bed, one of the civilian men said quietly, Colonel. Both women turned. Harlan Vespri's eyes were open. Not fully. Not in the wide, alert way of someone fully surfacing from anesthesia. A narrow fraction, eyes tracking with the deliberate effort of someone working through tremendous physical effort to accomplish a small thing. His gaze moved across the ceiling, then slowly, with visible difficulty, to the right, to Sarah. His focus held. Imprecise, still clouded by sedation and injury and however many hours of sustained voluntary muscular suppression, but present, intentional. His lips moved. No sound came out. But the shape was clear, 2 syllables. Sarah didn't look away. She nodded once, very slightly. Colonel Stout had her radio out. Her voice was quiet and fast. We have confirmation. Begin the secondary protocol. I need neurology and a full trauma team in ICU 4 in 15 minutes, and I need someone to find Preston Morrow and bring him to this floor. The room became organized in the specific way of people who had planned for this and were now executing the plan, and Sarah stepped back to give them space. She moved to the wall beside the monitoring station and stayed there, out of the way and in the room, which was where she intended to stay. At 2:44 a.m., Preston Morrow arrived on the floor. He came in his street clothes. Someone had reached him at home, or wherever he'd been at this hour, and he hadn't taken time to change, which told Sarah something about the nature of the call that had brought him in. He looked like a man who had spent the last several hours in a state of controlled anxiety that was now tipping towards something less controlled. He stopped in the doorway of ICU 4 and looked at the room. The military personnel, the civilian investigators, the monitoring equipment running its full array, and Harlan Vespri with his eyes partially open and a neurologist Sarah had never seen before conducting a rapid assessment at bedside. Then Morrow looked at Sarah. She held his gaze without expression. She had said what she needed to say to him earlier. There was nothing left to add. Dr. Morrow, Colonel Stout stepped forward. I'm going to need you to walk me through every clinical decision made regarding this patient from the time of admission. He stopped, started again. I followed standard protocol for traumatic brain injury. You co-signed a transfer order with a physician who holds no valid credentials in this state to a facility that is not a medical center for a patient whose clinical documentation contains unresolved concerns flagged by your own nursing staff. Stout's voice was not loud. It was much worse than loud. I need you to walk me through those decisions, in detail, starting now. Morrow looked once more at Sarah. She thought she saw something in his face that might have been shame, if shame had anywhere left to go. Then he looked at Stout and said, I want a lawyer present. That's your right, Stout said. We'll accommodate it. You'll remain on this floor until then. One of the civilian men moved to stand near the doorway, which was not technically blocking it, but which made the meaning clear. Sarah left the room. She went to the nursing station and sat down and wrote up the 2:19 a.m. events in the incident system. Then the 2:33 a.m. observation. Patient's eyes open, volitional gaze direction, lip movement, with clinical precision and no editorializing. She noted Stout's arrival, the military medical team's presence, and the suspension of transfer pending military medical review. She was 3/4 through the documentation when Cassie appeared beside her. I heard, Cassie said. She was in her street clothes. Off shift must have come back in. Her face was doing several things at once. Is he actually... He opened his eyes, Sarah said. Tracked movement. Attempted vocalization. Cassie sat down heavily in the chair beside her. He was conscious this whole time. Aware, Sarah said carefully. The extent of his physical capacity is still being assessed, but yes. And Morrow is on the floor. Military has him. Oh, Cassie was quiet for a moment. And the man who came in at 2 a.m. last night, the one with the expensive suit, I don't know where he is. Sarah had been thinking about this. That's someone else's problem to find. But Cassie had gone still in a different way, looking past Sarah toward the elevator bank. Sarah followed her gaze. The elevator had opened. Coming out of it was the older man from the security office, the one with the ex-military posture who had sat across from Sarah and asked about her record. He was moving quickly, which was a change from his previous deliberate economy of motion, and he wasn't alone. The man beside him was younger, with the particular physical composition of someone who spent serious time in serious training, and both of them were heading away from the ICU toward the back stairwell, away from where Colonel Stout's team was, toward the administrative wing. Sarah stood up. Watch the station, she said to Cassie. Sarah. She was already moving. She didn't run. Running drew attention and closed off options. She walked fast, which in a hospital at 3 a.m. was unremarkable, and she went through the door to the administrative corridor and stopped at the corner. The older man was at the end of the hall, at the door to the medical records archive room, and he had a key card in his hand. The younger man was watching the corridor. Neither of them had seen Sarah yet. She had about 4 seconds before the door opened, and whatever was in that archive room was no longer in that archive room. She pulled out her work phone and did something she almost never did. She called the nursing station's main line, and when Deb Alcott, still on night shift, always on night shift, picked up on the second ring, Sarah said clearly and without preamble, Deb, I need you to call a code gray for the administrative corridor on 2, right now. Code gray. Security response for a non-violent, unauthorized presence. Deb didn't ask questions, which was one of the many reasons Sarah appreciated her. The intercom tone sounded within 10 seconds, and with it the announcement that brought a security response to this specific location. The older man looked up from the keycard reader. Their eyes met. He had the face of someone who had run out of good options and was now deciding among the bad ones. For 3 seconds, Sarah genuinely didn't know which way it was going to go. Then the younger man said something short and sharp, and the older man took the keycard away from the reader, and they turned back toward the elevator. Halverton General's security team arrived 40 seconds later. Sarah was standing at the corner of the corridor, and she told them clearly what she had seen, who the men were to the best of her knowledge, and in which direction they'd gone. One of the security officers was already on his radio. From the stairwell at the far end of the corridor there was the sound of a door opening. Then Colonel Stout's voice, clear and carrying, "Stand where you are. Federal agents are on this floor." Sarah leaned against the corridor wall and exhaled slowly. Her hands were shaking very slightly, which was the first time that had happened tonight. She noted it without judgment. The body's accounting came when it came, regardless of timing, and the important thing was that it was coming now rather than 4 hours ago. She pressed her palms flat against the wall and breathed. At 3:42 a.m., a federal investigator she hadn't met yet found her in the corridor and asked her, with the careful courtesy of someone conducting a formal interview, to describe in order everything she had observed since 10:58 p.m. the previous evening. Sarah described it. The investigator took notes. At the end, he said, "You have a background in forward medical support." "Yes," she said. "That's how you recognize the cardiac pattern." "That's how I knew what to look for." She paused. Recognizing it still took looking. He nodded, made a note. "We'll need a formal written statement. Can you come in tomorrow?" "I have a shift at 7 p.m. "Before 7 then." She nodded. He left. Sarah sat down in one of the corridor chairs that existed for family members waiting during procedures, which was a thing she had never done. Sat in one of these chairs on this side of the information divide. Being the person waiting to hear what happened next, rather than the one going in and out of rooms and managing the flow of events. It was a strange feeling. Not bad, exactly. just strange. At 4:11 a.m., Stout came to find her. She sat down in the chair beside Sarah without preamble, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Down the corridor, there was still movement, people going in and out of the archive room, now under a different kind of supervision, and the distant sound of organized activity from the direction of the ICU. "He's stable," Stout said. "The neurology team is doing a full assessment. The sedation that was introduced into his IV line, that's what was suppressing his motor function. Not the injury. The injury was real but survivable. The sedation was maintaining the appearance of vegetative state." Sarah closed her eyes for a single second, then opened them. "Someone on the medical team administered it," she said. "Someone with access to his IV line and the clinical knowledge to maintain a dose that suppressed motor output without killing him." Stout's voice was neutral. "We'll know more when the tox panel comes back. The man who came in at 2 a.m., we have him. He was detained in the parking structure." She paused. "He's a defense contractor. His company, Viridian Medical Consulting, has been under counterintelligence review for 6 months. He's the senior logistics officer for a classified program that Vespri was auditing when the explosion occurred." "He came to increase the sedation dosage," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. It was the shape of the thing she'd been carrying since 2:11 a.m., when the suppression event had occurred 9 minutes after the man's arrival. "Most likely," Stout said. "The tox panel will confirm it." The corridor was quiet between them for a moment. "You've been awake for—" Stout glanced at her watch. 20-some hours. "I'm used to it." "I know." A pause. "I know what your service record says, Voss. I read it on the way here." Sarah looked at her sideways. "All of it?" "The relevant parts." Stout turned to face her directly. "Why didn't you put it on your hospital application?" Sarah thought about how to answer that. "I wanted to be somewhere quiet," she said finally. "I wanted to be somewhere where I was just a nurse, and nobody needed me to be anything else." Stout nodded slowly. "And how's that been working?" Sarah almost laughed. It surprised her. "Not great," she said. "Apparently." From the direction of ICU 4, a sound she hadn't heard from that room before. A sound she associated with a different version of this, with field stations and recovery tents and the particular exhausted relief of a patient returning to functional consciousness after something that had nearly not been survivable. A voice. Harlan Vespri's voice, rough with disuse and compromised by sedation and barely loud enough to reach the corridor, saying something short and specific to someone in the room. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice was real. Stout stood up. Her radio crackled and she answered it, and her expression shifted in a way that Sarah read immediately as new information. Not bad, but urgent. "There's a problem," Stout said. Sarah stood up too. "The man we detained in the parking structure," Stout said. "Raymond Holt, your hospital security chief, let him into the building 40 minutes before we arrived. Holt's log shows he badged him in through the East Service entrance." The East Service entrance. The same door Sarah had used that morning, the one that the custodial team always propped open. "Holt," Sarah said. "The man who had called her to the security office at midnight. The man who had, she'd thought at the time, simply been carrying out someone else's directive. Holt's been on the facility's security contract through a subsidiary of Viridian," Stout said. 4 years. He's been their access point into the building." Sarah absorbed this. "The man in the archive room," she said. "He wasn't trying to remove the monitoring data? The monitoring data was already copied. That's what the 7:48 a.m. access was this morning. He was trying to access something else." Stout was already on her radio. "What?" Vespri was an admiral auditing a classified program. Sarah moved as she spoke, toward the archive room, toward the 2 federal agents who were still working inside it. If he found evidence of the compromise during the audit, physical documentation, not digital, he would have had it with him when he was brought in. Or on him, or... She stopped outside the archive room. The door was open. The agents inside were working through filing boxes and digitized records on a terminal. Standard records archive, nothing unusual, nothing that explained why a man from a DoD-adjacent contractor had stood at this door with a keycard at 3 in the morning. Sarah looked at the keycard reader on the wall beside the door. Then she looked at the door itself, the frame, the threshold. Hospitals retained patient property in secure storage during admission. Clothing, personal effects, valuables. All of it logged and held until discharge or, in the case of a vegetative patient with no next of kin, transferred to the federal liaison's custody. The federal liaison who was one of the suits in the hallway. "Where is Vesperi's patient property?" Sarah asked. The agent closest to the door looked up. "It would have been held in the admissions property lockup," Sarah said. "Ground floor, east corridor. But if the federal liaison logged it as federal property, it would have been transferred to—" She stopped. Because the answer to that question, where the transfer would have gone, what chain of custody would have received it, and who controlled that chain, was the same answer to a different question. And the man who had been standing at this door with a key card that had never been reported to Colonel Stout's team was not someone who worked in this hospital. He worked for the man who had logged the property transfer. Sarah turned to find Stout already on her radio again, already 3 steps ahead of where Sarah was, already issuing an order to secure the admissions property lockup on the ground floor east corridor, which meant she'd arrived at the same conclusion from a different angle, which was the thing about people who were good at this kind of work. The angles were different, but the destination was the same. From 2 floors below, Sarah heard the sound of a door hitting a wall too hard. Then running. Then nothing. The running stopped before Sarah reached the stairwell door. She heard it cut off mid-stride, the particular acoustic signature of someone making a decision rather than being physically stopped. And then there was a different kind of silence from below. The kind that meant either someone had been caught or someone had gone very still on purpose. She took the stairs down anyway. The ground floor east corridor was narrow and fluorescent lit in the way of all hospital service corridors, and it smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of air that didn't circulate enough. 3 doors down from the stairwell exit was the admissions property lockup, a room the size of a large closet with a coded door and a log system that was supposed to create an accountable chain of custody for everything that came through the hospital's admissions desk. The door was open. The lock panel was dark, no power, which meant the circuit had been physically interrupted, which meant someone had done it deliberately and had the knowledge to do it fast. Standing just inside the doorway, with his hands raised and a federal agent's weapon at close range, was Raymond Holt. He didn't look like a man who had been running. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and arrived at the only position available to him, which was this one. His face was arranged in the careful neutrality of someone who was already thinking about what he was going to say in the next room. Sarah stayed back. This was not her part of it. The agent, one of Stout's civilian investigators, the younger one, had Holt's wrists secured inside of 90 seconds and was already speaking into his radio. Sarah looked past them into the property room. The shelving was organized with the standardized labeling the hospital used for patient property. Name, admission date, unit number. Vesperi's shelf was visible from the door. The property bag was there. The sealed, logged bag that should have contained whatever he'd been carrying when they brought him in. It was open. The contents were partially on the shelf and partially not. Whatever had been taken was gone, but whatever had been left was still in place. Clothing, a watch, a wallet, ordinary personal effects, things with no value to anyone trying to remove evidence of a classified program audit. The extraordinary things were missing. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. The older one. She stepped back from the doorway and answered. "Storage device," the voice said without preamble. "Encrypted. About the size of a thumb drive, but different housing. Did you see it in the room?" "No." She looked back at the open bag. Someone was here before Holt. Holt was running interference, not extraction. The device is already gone. A pause. "How long ago?" "The door was already open when I got here. 5 minutes ahead of us, maybe more." "Third party," the voice said. Not surprised. Recalibrating. Someone Holt was running cover for, not with. "Who else had access to this building tonight that we don't have eyes on?" "Working on it. Stay on this floor." The line cut out. She put the phone away and thought about the East Service entrance, the door that custodial propped open, the door she'd used herself this morning, the door Holt had used to badge in the Viridian contractor 40 minutes before Stout arrived. But Holt had been in the security office with Sarah from midnight to approximately 12:15. And the archive room attempt had been at 3 a.m. And in between, someone had been in this property room. Not the contractor. He'd been detained in the parking structure. Someone else. Someone who had moved through this building quietly enough that nobody had flagged them, which in a hospital at 3 a.m. with military personnel on the second floor required either legitimate credentials or exceptional familiarity with the building's patterns. Sarah walked to the end of the corridor and looked at the service exit door. The magnetic lock light was green, but it should have been red from the inside. The interior lock defaulted to secure except during custodial hours, which ended at midnight. A green light meant the lock had been released from an authorized source within the last hour. She pushed the door. It opened onto the hospital's service loading area, a concrete apron, dumpsters, a covered walkway to the parking structure, and at this hour, the particular emptiness of spaces that existed for function rather than people. Sodium lights made the concrete orange and flat. The parking structure ramp was 20 meters to the left. Sarah stood in the open doorway and looked. There was no one visible. The loading area held the specific stillness of a place that had recently been in use. The quality of the air, the faint sense of disturbance, the way the emptiness felt populated rather than simply empty. She went back inside. At 4:03 a.m., Colonel Stout assembled everyone in the second-floor conference room that was normally used for surgical case reviews. It held a long table and a wall-mounted screen and 8 chairs, and it now held Sarah, 2 federal investigators, a military intelligence officer Sarah was meeting for the first time, and a man from the hospital's legal compliance office who had clearly been dressed in a hurry and kept touching his collar. Stout stood at the front without using the screen. "What we know," she said. "Holt is in custody. The Viridian contractor, his name is Marcus Fell, is in custody." Fell administered an escalating sedation protocol to Vespri through access provided by a complicit member of the hospital's clinical staff, whose identity we'll have from the tox panel and medication logs within the hour. The property room was accessed between 2:40 and 3 a.m. by an individual we don't yet have. The storage device containing Vespri's audit documentation is not in the building. She paused. "Let that sit. What we also know," she said, "is that Admiral Vespri is conscious, medically stable, and has communicated the existence and approximate content of the documentation to our team. He knows what's on it. That means the device, wherever it is no longer the only source." Sarah watched the military intelligence officer across the table, a man named Driscoll, who had said almost nothing since arriving, write something briefly on a notepad and then cap his pen. "The third party," Sarah said, "the one who accessed the property room, who had building familiarity and after-hours access that didn't go through Holt." Stout looked at her. "We're working a short list." "Ellard Foss," Sarah said, "the consulting neurologist who co-signed the transfer order. He was never on site. We have no record of him physically entering this building, but his credential access would have been established in the system when the transfer order was filed. If someone created a building access entry under his credentials, that's already being checked," Driscoll said. It was the first full sentence he'd produced. He said it without looking up from his notepad. "It won't be under Foss," Sarah said. "His credentials were used to move the transfer paperwork, but Foss doesn't actually exist as a practicing physician. The license is real, but the person behind it has been operating under institutional cover. Whatever name goes with the building access entry tonight will be another layer of the same cover." The room was quiet. Driscoll looked up. "Why do you think Foss doesn't exist?" he asked. It wasn't skeptical. It was the question of someone checking whether she'd gotten there by evidence or intuition. "Because I ran the license against the Colorado Medical Board's practitioner database, the Virginia Medical Board's current active roster, and 3 professional directories. There is no record of an Ellard Foss who has practiced neurological medicine at any institution in any traceable way. The license exists. The person behind it has no history." She paused. "That takes institutional cover to maintain." Driscoll wrote on the notepad again. Stout said, "We'll need your written account of that research. Everything you accessed, when, and what you found. I documented it when I did it. Timestamps are in the log." "Good." Stout looked at the compliance officer, who had been silent through this entire exchange with the expression of someone attending a meeting in a language they didn't quite speak. "Mr. Abrams, the clinical staff access review. What's your timeline?" Abrams adjusted his collar. "Medication log review is going to take—" He glanced at one of the investigators, who gave him a look. "We can have preliminary findings in 2 hours." "One," Stout said. "One is—" Another look from the investigator. "1 hour," he said. Stout dismissed the room. She stopped Sarah at the door. "Get something to eat," she said. "There's going to be a full formal statement process starting at 6 a.m., and it's going to take most of the morning. My shift starts at 7 p.m. "Your shift," Stout said, with the first trace of something dry in her voice, "is going to look different today. I'll coordinate with your administration." Sarah nodded and went to the break room on the second floor and made coffee from the machine that was always too bitter and sat at the table by the window. Outside, the mountains had started to show against the sky. A darker line against the pre-dawn gray, the specific moment when you could see them again without yet being able to call it light. She drank the bad coffee and thought about Harlan Vespri saying something in a voice rough from disuse, and the shape of the words she'd seen on his lips in ICU 4, and the way the cardiac pattern had changed when someone familiar had walked into that room. She thought about what it cost a person to lie in a bed for 36 hours without moving, to suppress the biological instinct to respond, to maintain a performance of complete incapacity while people decided your fate around you. She thought about the training it required, the discipline. And then she thought about all the hours he'd been in that room, listening and what he had heard. Her phone buzzed. The older one. "We found the access log entry, building entry at 1:54 a.m. under a credential registered to the hospital's Federal Patient Liaison Office. The liaison on file is the suit, the one currently in custody. His credential was used, but he was already in the building at that point. Someone else used his access profile." Sarah stared at the message, a credential used by someone other than its registered holder, which meant either the holder had loaned it, voluntary, coordinated, or it had been duplicated, which required either technical access or enough institutional presence to make a copy during legitimate credential processing. "How long would it take to duplicate a hospital access credential?" she typed back. "With the right equipment, 12 minutes. With the right authority, less." She put the phone down and thought about the timeline. The suits had arrived with Vespri. Their credentials had been processed through the hospital's security intake. Standard procedure. She'd seen it happen with law enforcement and federal officials before. The intake happened at the admissions security desk. The security desk was managed by the security office, managed by Raymond Holt. She went back to the conference room. Stout was still there, on a call, and she held up one finger when Sarah appeared in the door. Sarah waited. When Stout ended the call, Sarah told her what she'd worked out: the timing, the credential duplication, the security intake process, Holt's position in it. Stout looked at her for a moment. "You're saying Holt didn't just provide building access tonight. He's been the facility's internal mechanism for the entire operation." "He had 4 years in a subcontract," Sarah said. "He would have known every security protocol, every camera position, every access point, and he had the legal standing to process credentials for everyone who came through that door, including the federal liaisons." She paused. "He made a copy of the liaison's credential during intake, used it, or gave it to someone else to use, for the property room access." "That someone else is still in the building," Stout said. "Or just outside it." Stout was already on her radio. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos of the organized kind. The kind Sarah associated with operations that had a command structure and were now executing contingencies. She stayed out of the way and stayed available, which was the right balance in a situation where she had context others lacked and no formal authority to act on it. At 5:08 a.m., they found him. He had not left the building. He was in the hospital's basement, the mechanical level below the parking structure access, in the section that held the HVAC system and the generator backup and the kind of industrial infrastructure that nobody visited unless something had broken. He was sitting on a toolbox with the storage device in his hand and a phone to his ear, and from the investigator's description, he appeared to have been in the process of transmitting data remotely when the signal was blocked by whatever equipment Stout's team had deployed in the last half hour. He was identified, in the formal federal record that Sarah would eventually read, as a man named Gerard Solis. He had 4 legitimate professional identities across 3 states, all of them in the medical or defense contracting sphere, and none of them named Ellard Foss. He had a Virginia medical license under one of those identities and no practicing history under any of them. He was taken into custody in the hospital's basement at 5:11 a.m. without incident, which was the word the report used, without incident, which Sarah translated to mean that he had recognized the math and made the same calculation Holt had made 2 hours earlier. That the position available to him was this one, hands up, and the rest was for lawyers. The storage device was intact. The transmission had not completed. By 6:30 a.m., Halverton General Hospital looked from the outside like a hospital. People arrived for early shifts. The cafeteria opened. The overnight staff handed off to day shift in the way they always did, with the slightly glazed quality of people who had been awake too long handing information to people who were not yet fully awake. Inside, it was a different thing. The second-floor ICU wing had federal investigators moving through it with the systematic patience of people who would be there for the remainder of the day. Preston Morrow had been in the security office, now occupied by 2 federal agents, Holt having been transferred to a holding vehicle outside, since 3 a.m., with an attorney who had arrived at 4:45 and had not looked pleased about any of it. The medication log review Abrams had promised in 1 hour had arrived in 70 minutes and had identified the specific clinical staff member responsible for maintaining the sedation protocol. A night physician named Dr. Theo Garland, who had been on call for the ICU during Vespry's admission and who had voluntarily presented himself to the investigators at 5:30 a.m., which was not the behavior of an innocent person, but was sometimes the behavior of a person who understood when the math had changed. Sarah gave her formal statement beginning at 6:10 a.m. It took 2 hours and 12 minutes, which was long, but not as long as she'd feared. The investigators were thorough and unhurried in the way of people who were building something that would need to hold up in environments with standards higher than a conference room at Halverton General. She was precise. She stuck to what she had observed, what she had documented, and what she had done, in that order. When she didn't know something, she said so. At 8:24 a.m., she was released from the formal statement process and told she'd be contacted for follow-up. She went to ICU 4. The military neurology team was in the process of completing their assessment. Harlan Vespry was more awake than he had been at 2:33 a.m., not dramatically, not in the way of someone recovered, but in the incremental way of someone who had been sedated for 36 hours and whose system was slowly reclaiming its own functioning. His eyes were open at a more normal width. He was receiving IV fluids, and the ventilator had been dialed back to assisted rather than controlled mode. A military physician Sarah didn't know was speaking to him in low, measured sentences and watching the responses. Sarah stood in the doorway. One of Stout's investigators was also in the room, seated at the back with a notepad, present but not pressing. The room had the quality of a place where something terrible had happened and the aftermath was underway. Not resolution, not yet, but the specific state of a crisis that had been contained. She was about to leave when Vespry's physician looked up and said, "He asked if you'd come in." Sarah came in. She stood at the bedside. Vespry's gaze tracked to her with the effortful deliberation of someone whose body was still catching up to his brain. His color was poor and his breathing was shallow, and he looked like a man who had been through something that had left real marks. He looked also like a man who knew exactly where he was and what had happened and who was in the room. His voice came out rough and low, and she had to lean forward to catch it. "I heard everything," he said. "I know," Sarah said. "The second night, 3 a.m. He stopped, adjusted. "You put your hand on the glass." She didn't say anything. "I couldn't tell you." He stopped again, and there was a quality to the stop that had nothing to do with the sedation. "I wanted you to know I heard you." "You told me," Sarah said. The exhale. Something shifted in his expression. It was complicated, the way things were complicated in people who had been through sustained high-stress experience and were still inside the processing of it. Not gratitude, something bigger and less articulate than that. The thing you felt when you had been at the very edge of something irreversible and had come back. "I have to ask you something," she said. He waited. The documentation you were carrying, the audit data, is what's on the device enough? He held her gaze for a long moment. His breathing was slow and measured, a habit that would probably take weeks to unlearn. It's enough, he said, for 3 of them. The 4th? He stopped. The 4th isn't in the device. Sarah went still. The 4th is in my head, he said. The device documents the program structure and the financial mechanism. But the identity of the senior official who authorized the compromised procurement, who signed off on the classified contract modification that allowed the breach, that's not documented. It was verbal. I was building the paper trail when the explosion happened. He looked at the ceiling. I know the name. I've known it for 4 weeks. But without corroboration? You're the corroboration, Sarah said. I'm one source. Uncorroborated testimony from a single military witness in a classified environment without documentary backup against a senior. He stopped. It needs more. The room was quiet. The investigator at the back had put down his pen. He was listening. Sarah thought about the property room, about the device that had been recovered, about the transmission that had not completed, which meant Gerard Solis had been trying to send the data somewhere. Not to destroy it, but to deliver it, which meant there was a recipient, and a recipient was a thread, and threads connected to things. The transmission, she said, from the basement. It didn't go through, but the destination IP was captured when they blocked the signal. The investigator behind her said, yes. Where does it route? A pause. Then, we're working on that. Sarah looked at Vespri. He had the expression of a man who had just understood something. Not new information, a new configuration of existing information. It routes to a secure server, he said, and the only people with access to that server type are program-level officials with Tier 3 clearance. He looked at the ceiling again, which narrows it to 11 people in the department. And you know which one, Sarah said. I know which one. The investigator was on his radio. The morning light was fully established outside the ICU window now. Colorado Spring light, horizontal and clear, coming through the glass and landing on the floor in the particular way of light that had cleared the mountains. It made the room look almost ordinary. Medical equipment and monitoring screens and the specific functional ugliness of a space built for crisis management. Harlan Vespri turned his head and looked at the light for a moment. Then he said, at full audible volume, the name. The investigator stopped talking into his radio. Sarah did not recognize the name. She would learn later from the documented federal record who the name belonged to. A deputy undersecretary with 31 years of institutional presence. A record that had been reviewed twice in the last decade for procurement irregularities that had never gone anywhere, and an access level that had given him visibility into every classified program Harlan Vespri had audited in the last 3 years. In the moment, she only heard the name, and she watched the investigator's face when he heard it, and she saw the specific quality of a person who recognized a name and understood immediately what the recognition meant for the scope of what they were dealing with. He stepped out of the room. He was on his phone before the door closed behind him. Stout appeared in the doorway 90 seconds later. She looked at Sarah, then at Vespri. Did he tell you? She asked Sarah. Yes? Stout looked at Vespri. Can you repeat it for the formal record? Bring me the recorder, he said. I'll give you everything. Stout left to get it. Sarah looked at Vespri. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. You should sleep, she said. Later. His voice was still rough. There's something you should know about what I heard the first night when they were discussing the case. He paused. Morrow, when the men from Viridian were in the room. He said, another pause, working through it. He said he'd been paid to manage the clinical documentation. Those were the words. Manage the documentation. He knew from the beginning. It wasn't pressure that made him agree. He'd agreed before I arrived. Sarah stood with that for a moment. She had suspected it. The shape of Morrow's behavior, the way he'd known Foss's name without looking it up, the way his voice had changed in his office, had pointed to pre-existing arrangement rather than coerced compliance. But suspecting and knowing were different things, and she'd been careful in her statements and her documentation to describe only what she had observed. Now she had a witness. "I'll tell Stout," she said. He nodded. Then, "Voss?" She paused. "What you did," he said. He stopped, started again, differently. "I'm not good at this part." "You don't have to be," she said. "No, I want to—" He stopped once more, and the frustration of it crossed his face, the gap between what he meant and what the sedation-roughened voice could carry. "You could have let it go," he said finally. "Every step. There were a dozen places where letting it go was the rational choice." Sarah thought about George Pittman, awake at 2 a.m. thinking about his wife. She thought about Walter Drum and deep-sea fish that made their own light. She thought about a younger version of herself learning, in circumstances very different from this, that letting it go had costs that didn't always show up immediately. "I've tried letting things go," she said. "I'm not very good at it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had entered any room he was in, he smiled. Brief, real, the expression of a man who understood exactly what she meant, because he had the same problem. "No," he said, "neither am I." From down the corridor, moving fast and purposeful, she heard Stout's voice, and then two other voices, and then the specific quality of sound that meant something had shifted again. Not a new crisis, but a new development, information arriving, the investigation extending its reach into a territory that began well outside the walls of Halverton General in the small mountain city of Dunmore, Colorado. Stout appeared in the doorway with a recording device in one hand and her phone in the other. Behind her were two investigators and a man in a suit that was different in specific ways from the other suits Sarah had seen tonight. Older, more careful, with the kind of institutional wear that came from decades of being in rooms where things were decided. He looked at Vespri. He looked at Sarah. Then he looked back at Stout and said, very quietly, "The Deputy Undersecretary's office was accessed at 4:50 a.m. this morning. Someone from his own staff used his credentials to pull the Viridian program file." Stout was very still. "Who?" "His chief of staff," the man said. "She submitted a voluntary disclosure to the IG's office at 5:15. She's been holding documentation for 2 months," he paused. "She was waiting for someone to establish the corroborating case." Sarah heard this and understood, a half second before anyone else spoke, what it meant. That the person who had been sitting inside that office, watching the Deputy Undersecretary manage and suppress and compromise, had been building her own parallel record, waiting for the moment when the external case was solid enough that her disclosure wouldn't be buried alongside the person doing the burying. She had been waiting for someone to do what Sarah had done. The room was very quiet. Then Vespri said, with the flatness of a man who had just seen the thing he'd been trying to reach for 4 weeks arrive from a completely unexpected direction. "Her name is Dolores Kwan." The man in the careful suit said, "Yes." "She's good," Vespri said. "I've worked with her." "She's in protective custody," the man said, "as of an hour ago." From the east window, the morning light had moved across the floor and was now reaching the edge of Vespri's bed, and outside, Dunmore, Colorado was conducting its ordinary morning. Traffic on the arterials, the high school opening, someone's dog walking too slowly, and its owner walking faster. All of it completely unaware of the rooms above it, and the things being said in them, and the years of consequence that were beginning, right now, to unspool. Sarah thought about 48 hours. She thought about 6 a.m. and a vehicle that hadn't come. She thought about the envelope in her kitchen drawer, and the legal pad notes, and all the places she could have stopped. Her shift started at 7 p.m. She had, she calculated, about 10 hours. She thought about Preston Morrow, who had agreed before Vespri arrived, and the exact legal weight of a conscious patient's testimony about what he had heard from his own hospital bed. She thought about the medication logs that would show Theo Garland's pattern of access. She thought about Marcus Fell's financial relationship with Viridian and the 4 years of Raymond Holt's security contract, and the paper trail that Dolores Kwan had been keeping for 2 months in an office 2,000 miles from here. All of it connected. All of it now in motion. And at the center of it, a quiet nurse who had frowned at a number on a cardiac monitor and decided not to agree. Stout looked at Sarah from the doorway. "There's one more thing," she said. Her voice had a quality Sarah hadn't heard from her yet. Not wariness, but a kind of careful deliberateness, like someone choosing words in a minefield. The Deputy Undersecretary's Chief of Staff, Kwan, her voluntary disclosure. She didn't just document the program compromise. Sarah waited. She documented who else had been watching it, who else inside the department knew and chose to manage rather than report. Stout looked at the man in the careful suit. He gave a slight nod. There are 7 names on the list. 7, Sarah said. One of them, Stout said, is the person who signed the original federal review request that brought the military medical team here tonight. The room shifted in the specific way of rooms where information changes the shape of everything that came before it. Sarah looked at her. Someone on your side sent the team here knowing the case was already compromised from their level. Knowing that bringing us here would surface the investigation before the evidence could be fully suppressed, Stout said. Yes. That's either someone trying to clean it up from the inside, Sarah said, or someone who panicked when my escalation report started moving. Or, Stout said, someone who has been trying to find a way to force this open for months and finally had an external event they could point to. The 3 possibilities sat in the room with them. Sarah thought about the older phone in her pocket, the number she'd contacted at 9:22 a.m. the previous morning, the reply that had come in 4 minutes, the voice on the line at 11:47 p.m. that had said give us 12 hours. She thought about the word us. She pulled out the phone. She looked at the contact. No name, only a number, the kind of number that routed through enough layers that tracing it directly was a project, not a task. She looked at Stout. I need to show you something, she said. Stout looked at the phone for 3 seconds without touching it. Who's the number registered to? She asked. I don't know, Sarah said. I've had it for 14 months. It was given to me by someone I served with before I left forward support. He said it was a channel for situations that didn't fit standard reporting structures. She paused. I used it twice before last night. Both times it connected me to people who had the right clearance and the wrong official pathway. Stout looked at the man in the careful suit. Something passed between them that Sarah read as pre-existing familiarity. Not surprise, but the specific quality of 2 people confirming something they had already partially mapped. Give me the number, Stout said. Sarah read it to her. Stout typed it into her own phone without writing it down, which meant she was sending it somewhere rather than recording it for later, and the someone she was sending it to responded within 40 seconds because Stout looked at her screen and her expression resolved into the particular flatness of confirmed information. It routes to the Inspector General's office, Stout said, specifically to a deputy IG who has been running a parallel counterintelligence inquiry into the Viridian procurement irregularities for 8 months. She looked up. He's one of the 7 names on Kwan's list. The 7 people who knew, Sarah said. The 7 who knew and chose different responses, Stout said. 5 managed, 2 documented. She put her phone away. Your contact is one of the 2 who documented. He's been trying to build an external corroborating case because everything generated internally was being routed through the Deputy Undersecretary's office before it reached the IG's formal process. Sarah absorbed this. The number she'd been given 14 months ago by a man she'd trusted because he had stood next to her in a field station in conditions she didn't discuss at job interviews. That number had been, the whole time, a thread connecting to something much larger and much older than the last 36 hours. She had pulled on it without knowing how far it went. It had held. Is he compromised? She asked. Your deputy IG. No, Stout said. He's been running the cleanest inquiry he could from inside a contaminated structure. He needed external verification to go above the Deputy Undersecretary's level, and he needed it to come from a source that couldn't be dismissed as internal. She looked at Sarah steadily. Your clinical documentation and your formal state-level filings created an external record that existed completely outside the federal reporting chain. Nobody inside the department could suppress it because nobody inside the department generated it. I didn't know that was what I was doing, Sarah said. I know. Stout held her gaze. That's why it worked. The morning outside had fully committed to itself by now. The light no longer tentative, the parking lot below filling with the ordinary daytime population of a hospital, people arriving for appointments and surgeries, and the routine management of things going wrong in human bodies. Sarah stood at the window of ICU 4 and looked at it and thought about all the ways a situation could be larger than you understood it to be while you were inside it, making one decision at a time. Behind her, Harlan Vespri was giving his formal statement to the recording device. His voice was still rough, but it was steady, and he spoke with the particular economy of someone who had been composing this account in his head for 36 hours and knew exactly what it needed to contain. Sarah went to get more bad coffee. She took it to the stairwell and sat on the top step and drank it, and let herself be tired for approximately 8 minutes, which was what she had time for. Then she went back to work. The next 6 weeks moved the way investigations moved. Not linearly, not dramatically, but in the grinding procedural way of institutions being held to account, which was slower and less cinematic than anyone involved preferred, but was, ultimately, the only way that produced results that lasted. Sarah was contacted 11 times for follow-up information. She gave 11 follow-up statements. She kept her notes organized and her documentation current, and she answered every question she was asked with the same careful precision she had used on the night it started. She continued her shifts at Halverton General. This was not initially comfortable. The East Wing day rotation she'd been moved to continued for the first 2 weeks, simply because the administrative machinery hadn't yet reorganized itself around what had happened. She showed up, did her work, and navigated the specific social weather of a workplace where something enormous had happened and people were processing it at different speeds and in different directions. Some of her colleagues treated her with a careful deference that she found more exhausting than hostility would have been. Others avoided her. A few, including Deb Alcott, were simply themselves, which was the most useful thing anyone could be. Preston Morrow did not return to work after that night. His attorney had advised him not to, which was sound professional advice, and the hospital's board had placed him on indefinite administrative leave by 10 a.m. on the morning after the arrests, which was a decision that arrived with unusual speed for a board that typically took 3 weeks to schedule a meeting. The speed, Sarah understood, had something to do with a call that went from Stout to the hospital's legal counsel at approximately 8 a.m., in which the nature of Morrow's documented prior agreement with Viridian was described in enough specific detail that the liability calculation became unmistakable. Dr. Theo Garland was suspended the same morning, pending investigation, on the basis of the medication log review that had taken Abrams 70 minutes instead of 1 hour. The review showed 9 separate instances of IV protocol modification on Harlan Vespri's chart, all within Garland's access window, all designed to maintain sedation levels that suppressed motor function without triggering alarm thresholds. It was careful work, from a clinical standpoint, precise enough to require genuine medical knowledge and deliberate enough to eliminate accident as an explanation. He had a lawyer by noon and did not speak publicly. He didn't need to. The medication log spoke with the unambiguous clarity of things that had been logged in real time by a system that had no stake in the outcome. Raymond Holt was charged at the federal level. Marcus Fell was charged at the federal level. Gerard Soley, the man with 4 identities and a Virginia medical license registered to none of them, was charged at the federal level under 3 separate statutes, one of which Sarah would not have been able to name before this happened, and which described a category of obstruction that specifically applied to interference with military intelligence documentation. His real name turned out to be something entirely different from any of the names he'd used, and the background that emerged from the federal record was the background of a man who had spent 20 years being very good at becoming other people in service of interests that paid well and didn't ask questions that would create documentation. The deputy undersecretary, whose name Sarah heard for the first time from Vespri's mouth in ICU 4 at approximately 8:45 a.m., and whose name she would hear many more times in the months that followed, was placed on administrative suspension pending investigation by day 3 and formally arrested by day 11. The case against him was built from 4 sources: the device recovered from Solis's possession in the basement, Dolores Kwan's 2 months of parallel documentation, Vespri's formal testimony, and the financial records that the federal investigation surfaced from the Viridian subsidiary contracts once Holt's cooperation, partial, strategic, self-interested, opened the procurement files. He was not a man who had acted alone, and the investigation took time to establish the full architecture of what he had built. But it held together, and when it reached the stage of formal charges, it held together in a way that prosecutors described in the language of people who spent their lives in rooms where language was chosen for durability, as comprehensive. Sarah read about most of this in documents. She was in the periphery of the case rather than its center, which was appropriate, and she preferred it. The center was where Vespri was, and Kwan, and the investigators who had the clearance and the institutional authority to do what came next. Sarah's part had been the part she could do, the part that required presence and observation and the particular stubbornness of not accepting a conclusion that the evidence didn't support. That part was done. What was not done in the weeks that followed was the smaller and less formal accounting that happened inside Halverton General Hospital. The reckoning that didn't involve federal charges but mattered in its own way to the people who had to keep coming to work in the building where it had all happened. The hospital's board of directors initiated an internal review the same week. Sarah was asked to participate, which she did, and which was considerably less comfortable than the federal statements had been, because the federal investigators were asking about things she had done, and the board review was asking about things other people had done, and the people asking were the same institution that employed both Sarah and the people being reviewed. She was precise. She was fair. She described what she had observed without editorializing, which was harder in that room than it had been in any other room because some of the people sitting across the table from her were people she had to work with, and the gap between accurate and kind was not always bridgeable. The review found that Morrow had engaged in conduct incompatible with his clinical and ethical obligations. His medical privileges at Halverton General were permanently revoked, a consequence that came from the board first and was then compounded by the state medical board, which initiated its own review on the basis of the federal investigation findings and concluded it within 30 days. The Colorado Medical Board's decision was public, which meant it was in the record, which meant it followed him. Sarah heard about this from Cassie, who texted her on a Thursday morning. Medical board made it official, license suspended pending full review. Could be permanent. Then after a moment, how do you feel about that? Sarah thought about it honestly. She thought about Morrow in his office at 6 a.m, the posture of a man who had told himself a story so many times it had become load-bearing, and about what it cost a person to agree to something like that, and then keep agreeing for however long it took for the patient to arrive. I feel like it's the right outcome, she texted back, and I feel like it's sad. Both things. Yeah, Cassie replied. Me too. Cassie, as it turned out, was the one who told Sarah about the board's other decision, the one that came at the end of the internal review 6 weeks after the night of the arrests. She didn't tell her directly. She told her by way of showing up at the nurses' station on the East Wing at the end of Sarah's shift on a Wednesday and saying, "You have a meeting with administration in 20 minutes, and you should probably not be still in your scrubs for it." What meeting? The one that's been scheduled for 3 days that Patricia Helm has been avoiding telling you about because she's embarrassed about her role in all of this. Cassie handed her a coffee. Go change. You have 18 minutes. The meeting was in a conference room on the 3rd floor, not the surgical one where Stout had assembled her team, but the administrative one that was used for things like contract negotiations and HR matters of significance. Present when Sarah arrived, the hospital's CEO, a woman named Vandra Osei, who had been in the position for 2 years and had the demeanor of someone who had taken the job knowing it would be difficult and had still been surprised by how difficult. The board chair, a man named Theodore Price, who was 70 and had been on the board long enough to remember what the hospital had been before it was this, and Patricia Helm, who was sitting with the posture of someone who had rehearsed her expression. Sarah sat down. Osei did the talking. She was direct about it, which Sarah appreciated. No preamble, no institutional throat-clearing. She acknowledged specifically and on the record that Sarah's clinical observation had been correct, that the administrative response to her concern filing had been inadequate, that her reassignment had been improperly motivated, and that the hospital's failure to act on her escalation in a timely manner had contributed to the continuation of a situation that harmed a patient. She said these things in the language of someone who had worked with legal counsel to ensure they were both accurate and appropriately qualified, which meant they were slightly more formal than they might otherwise have been, but the substance of them was real. Then she said, "We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Critical Care Nursing." Sarah looked at her. The ICU nursing director position has been functionally vacant since the departure of the previous director 8 months ago, Osei continued. The interim has been inadequate. We've been conducting a search. The board's view, following the review, is that the search is over. I've been here 8 months, Sarah said. Yes. The standard qualification for a director position at a hospital this size is, you're aware of the qualifications, Osei said. We're aware of your record, all of it. She let that sit for a moment. The decision is the board's to make, and the board has made it. But I want to be clear that this isn't remediation. We're not offering you a position because we owe you something. We're offering you this position because you're the person we want running that unit. Sarah looked at Theodore Price. He had the particular stillness of a very old man who had seen a lot of outcomes and was watching this one with the patience of someone who already knew how it resolved. If I take it, Sarah said, I'm going to run it the way I think it should be run. Yes, Osei said. Which means I'm going to create a clinical observation protocol that doesn't route through the attending physician of record when the concern involves that physician's own decisions. We'd expect that. And I'm going to review the security contract structure for the entire building. Also expected. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Patricia Helm was looking at the table, which was fine. They would work out whatever needed to be worked out between them, eventually, in the way that colleagues worked things out when they had to keep occupying the same building. Okay, Sarah said. Yes. She went home and slept for 11 hours, which was longer than she had slept in a single stretch since before she'd left forward support. And when she woke up, the light in her apartment was the late afternoon light of a Colorado spring day that had decided to be warm, and she lay in it for a few minutes doing nothing, which was a thing she almost never did and which turned out to be fine. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Harlan Vespri was released from the military medical facility where he'd been transferred for his recovery. Released was the formal word. What it meant practically was that he was able to walk out of a building under his own power and get into a vehicle and go somewhere that was not a hospital, which was a different kind of milestone than the clinical ones, and in some ways a harder one to achieve. He called Sarah on a Tuesday morning. She was in her new office, the ICU nursing director's office, a room she was still getting used to, with a window that looked out over the hospital's small courtyard and a desk that was too large for someone who preferred to do most of her work standing up. And she almost let it go to voicemail because the number was one she didn't recognize. She picked up. Voss? He said. Admiral? She pulled the chair away from the desk and sat in it. You sound better. I look terrible, he said, with the flatness of someone who was reporting an objective fact. But I'm told it's temporary. A pause. I wanted to tell you before it becomes public. The deputy undersecretary accepted a plea agreement this morning. Sarah was quiet. 31 counts, Vespri said, including 2 under the classified information statutes. He's cooperating with the ongoing investigation in exchange for less than he deserved. That's the legal reality of complex federal cases. His voice was even, but not without weight. It means it ends on a defined timeline rather than a 7-year litigation. And it means the cooperation produces additional information about the program structure that wouldn't otherwise surface. You think it's the right outcome, Sarah said. I think it's an outcome, he said. I've been in long enough to know the difference. Another pause. Felon Solis aren't cooperating. Their trials are scheduled. Holt cooperated early, which reduced his exposure. Garland reached an agreement last week, lost his license, significant civil liability, in 2 years. A long beat. Morrow is still in negotiation. His attorney is arguing clinical coercion, which is not accurate, but it's an argument. I heard, Sarah said. She had heard it through the hospital's legal counsel, who had kept her informed because her testimony was likely to be relevant. It won't hold, Vespri said. What he said on the recording. Manage the documentation. There's no construction of clinical coercion that covers pre-admission agreement. His voice was careful and certain, the voice of someone who had spent a career reading the weight of evidence. He knew before I arrived. That's the record. Sarah looked out the courtyard window. Someone was sitting on the bench down there, a patient in a hospital gown, older woman, getting some air in the midday warmth. taking it in. Yes, she said, that's the record. I'm testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 3 weeks, Vespri said. Open session for the first 40 minutes, then classified. The open portion will cover the program structure and the procurement failure. Not the full intelligence picture, but enough. He paused. Dolores Kwan is testifying the same day. Sarah thought about Kwan, a woman she had never met, sitting in an office 2,000 miles away, watching something unfold for months, choosing to wait for the right external moment instead of being consumed by it. Choosing the patience of the long game over the urgency of the immediate. A different kind of stubbornness than Sarah's, and no less necessary. Is she okay? Sarah asked. She's better than okay, Vespri said. She's the kind of person who gets better when the thing they've been holding up finally has other hands on it. He paused. Like some other people I know. Sarah almost said something modest. She stopped herself because modesty was sometimes accurate and sometimes just the habit of making yourself smaller for people who hadn't earned the right to the smaller version. I'm glad it's over, she said instead. It's not entirely over, he said. The investigation into the broader program is going to take another year, minimum. And there's the committee testimony and the cases that are going to trial. It's going to be in the news again. Another pause. Your name is going to be in it. I know. The parts of your record that you'd rather stay quiet. I know, she said again. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it in the incremental way of someone who had made a decision and was making peace with its implications one morning at a time. People are going to know I served. They're going to ask about the gaps in my hospital resume, and some of them are going to figure out what the gaps mean. That's what happens. She looked at the courtyard. The older woman on the bench had her face tilted up toward the sun. It was going to come out eventually. Better this way than some other way. Your colleagues at the hospital, Vespri said. How are they treating you? Sarah thought about Cassie, who had brought her coffee before a meeting she hadn't known was scheduled. She thought about Deb Alcott, who treated her exactly as she always had, which was the precise right response. She thought about Walter Drum, who had been discharged healthy on the morning after the arrests, and had left a card at the nurse's station that said simply, "The lady who sat with me." I hope things worked out. She thought about George Pittman, who had come back to the hospital 3 weeks later for a follow-up, and had asked for her specifically, and had, when she came to his room, said nothing about what he'd seen on the news, but had simply told her that his blood sugar was well controlled and his daughter was coming to visit, and that he thought she'd like her. Some of them are awkward about it, she said. Some of them are fine. Most of them are somewhere in between. She paused. It's a workplace. People figure it out. That's a more generous assessment than I expected, Vespri said. I've been practicing being generous, Sarah said. It's harder than it looks. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I'm told that too. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable quiet of two people who had been through something together and didn't need to fill the space between them with more words than the moment required. Voss, he said, the night you put your hand on the glass. You mentioned that. I know. I'm going to mention it again. His voice was different now. Not the careful record language, not the tactical precision, just a person talking. I had been in that room for 22 hours. I had been through the explosion and the transport and whatever they gave me to keep me under, and it was harder than I expected, holding still, not responding. You do the training, you understand the principle, but the actual sustained experience of it is different from the training. Sarah said nothing. She was listening. The things I heard in that room, he said. Morrow and the Viridian people deciding my status before they'd finished examining me. The transfer arrangements. The discussion about the documentation. A pause. And then you, doing the vital check. Just doing it. Like I was a patient who deserved the standard of care. And then the hand on the glass. He stopped. I had been trained to not respond under any circumstances, and the hand on the glass was the only time I came close to failing that. Sarah looked at the window for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because you should know what you did, he said. Not the clinical observation, and not the documentation, and not the filings. Those mattered, and I'm alive, and those people are in custody because of them. But the hand on the glass was something else. That was human, in a room where everything else was tactical. He paused. I needed that. I didn't know I needed it. Sarah looked at the courtyard window. The older woman on the bench had stood up and was walking slowly back toward the hospital entrance, taking her time, not hurrying, moving at the pace that was available to her, which was the pace that was enough. I didn't know it was going to matter, Sarah said. I just did it. That's usually how those things work, Vespri said. He was discharged from federal protective custody the following week and returned to limited duty, which was the military's way of keeping someone in the building without pretending they were fully operational, and which Vespri described in a subsequent brief call as bureaucratically humiliating and medically appropriate in exactly that tone. The Senate testimony happened on a Tuesday morning in May. Sarah watched the open session on her laptop in the ICU director's office between rounds. Vespri testified in his uniform, which he'd lost some weight from, but which he wore with the unconscious authority of someone who had been in uniform since before Sarah was born. He was precise, measured, and thorough. Kwan testified after him and was all of those things, and also, at one point, quietly angry in the way of someone who had watched something happen for months and had made the disciplined choice not to act until the moment was right, and who was now past the moment and letting some of what had accumulated show. The open session created the news coverage that Vespri had said it would. Sarah's name was in it, not prominently, but present. The coverage described her as a nurse who had filed clinical documentation that initiated the external audit trail. One reporter, more thorough than the others, mentioned her military background. The story that resulted was accurate, which was more than Sarah had expected and more than she'd prepared for. Her phone was busy for 3 days. She answered the calls that mattered and let the others go to voicemail, and did not read most of the voicemails. She gave one brief interview to a journalist she'd been advised by Stout's office was serious, and she said in it what she believed, that she had done what any nurse should do, which was look at the evidence rather than the consensus, and that the reason it had been complicated was not because the clinical signs were ambiguous, but because she had been in an environment where her credibility had been decided before she opened her mouth. She said it plainly, without performance. The journalist printed it mostly as she'd said it, which was the best you could hope for. What she did not say in the interview, because it wasn't the journalist's to have, was the thing she thought about most in the weeks after. Not the federal cases, or the testimony, or the administrative restructuring. The thing she thought about most was the moment in ICU 4 when she had looked at a cardiac monitor and seen something that didn't fit, and had made the decision to say so rather than let it go. That moment had been ordinary. She hadn't known, standing there, that it was going to be anything other than a clinical concern that would probably get her nowhere. She hadn't had a view of what it was part of. She'd had a pattern on a screen that didn't match the conclusion in the room, and she'd had enough experience of the gap between what people said was true and what the evidence showed to trust the evidence over the room. That was the whole of it. Everything else was downstream from that. She thought about this because she had started to notice it in her new role. The moments when the newer nurses looked at something and then looked at the room and chose the room. The social gravity of institutional consensus. The way a person learned over time that the path of least resistance was to agree, and then learned to call the agreement professional judgment, and then couldn't tell the difference anymore. She wasn't sure what to do about that, except be the person in the unit who didn't do it, and be visible enough that people knew it was possible. On the last Thursday in May, 6 weeks after Vespri's Senate testimony, and 11 weeks after the night of the arrests, Sarah was finishing the late afternoon round in the ICU when Cassie found her outside one of the rooms. "There's someone at the nurse's station," Cassie said. "Military. He said he has something to deliver." Sarah went to the station. The man was young, mid-20s, in dress uniform, with the serious expression of someone who had been given a specific task and was focused on executing it correctly. He held a flat document case. "Nurse Sarah Voss?" he asked. "Yes?" He handed her the case with both hands. "From Rear Admiral Vespri, ma'am." He left. Sarah opened the case. Inside was a formal letter of commendation from the Department of the Army, signed by 3 people she recognized and 1 she didn't. It described, in the careful language of official recognition, her actions during the period in question and their contribution to the outcome. It used words like exceptional clinical judgment and sustained moral courage under institutional pressure, which were words she would not have chosen, but which were, she acknowledged to herself, not inaccurate. Behind the letter was a handwritten note on plain paper. 3 lines, no letterhead. You didn't need the record to do what you did, but you should know the record is proud of itself for producing you. HV. Sarah read it twice. Then she put it back in the case. Cassie was watching from 6 feet away with an expression that she was not entirely managing to keep neutral. Well? Official commendation, Sarah said. And the note? Sarah looked at her. Personal. Cassie nodded. She understood the boundary. Are you going to frame the commendation? Sarah thought about the blank walls of the director's office, which she had not yet decorated because she kept not getting around to it, and also because she was not sure what she wanted on them. She thought about what it communicated, hanging a commendation. The story it told about why you were there. No, she said. I'm going to keep it in the case. She went back to the round. The ICU at evening was its own particular world, quieter than the day, louder than the deep night, in a register of sustained attention that had always suited her. She knew these rooms now. She knew which monitors had lag in the secondary lead, and which families were reliable historians, and which physicians responded to pages quickly, and which ones required a second page framed as urgency, even when the first page had technically communicated urgency. She was in the middle of all of this, walking between rooms, when a young nurse named Petra stopped her in the corridor with the specific expression of someone who has a question they've been holding. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Petra was 24 and had been at Halverton General for 5 months. She was careful and observant and had, Sarah had noticed, a tendency to look at data before looking at the room, which was a good instinct that she hadn't yet learned to trust. The night it happened, Petra said, with the Admiral. How did you know? How did you know you were right and everyone else was wrong? Sarah considered the question. She'd been asked versions of it, by journalists, by the investigators, by the board review. She'd given answers that were accurate. Clinical pattern recognition, training, prior experience with volitional HRV management. She gave Petra a different one. I didn't know I was right, she said. I knew the data didn't fit the conclusion. Those are different things. She watched Petra processing this. Being right is the outcome. The decision is made before you know the outcome. The decision is just, do you trust what you see, or do you trust the room? Petra thought about it. What if you trust what you see and you're wrong? Then you're wrong, Sarah said, and you document it accurately, and you correct it, and you learn from it, but you're wrong with evidence, which is a recoverable position. She paused. The other kind of wrong, where you ignore the evidence because the room told you to, that one's harder to come back from, because you've trained yourself not to see. Petra nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone filing something away for later when they would need it. Sarah left her to her work. She did 2 more rooms and then stood at the window at the end of the ICU corridor, the same window she had stood at on that first night, looking out at the parking structure in the dark. Now it was evening, the light going golden low, the mountains in the distance doing what Colorado mountains did at this hour, which was become very large and very clear and very indifferent to everything happening below them. She thought about what she'd told Petra and whether it was true. It was true. It was also incomplete. Because the honest version included the part that wasn't clinical, the part that was just her, standing in a hallway at 1 a.m., refusing to agree that a man was gone because something in the data said otherwise, and being tired and overdue for a night's sleep, and not entirely certain she wasn't wrong, and doing it anyway. That part didn't have a clean professional name. It was just the thing you either had or didn't. The stubborn, inconvenient, professionally costly refusal to close a question the evidence hadn't answered. She had not arrived at it cleanly. She had learned it in places that had left marks, and she had spent years trying to put it down. And she had discovered on a night shift in a mid-sized Colorado hospital that it was not a thing you could put down. It was a thing you were. The mountains outside stayed what they were, enormous and plain and old enough not to care about any of it. And Sarah Voss, director of critical care nursing, Halverton General Hospital, formerly of the 91st Forward Support Medical Company, stood at the window in the evening light and breathed evenly, which was a habit, and let herself be exactly where she was, which was harder, and thought that this was what it felt like when the thing you'd been carrying for years finally found the shape of the place it was supposed to go. Not victory, not resolution, not the clean cinematic ending where the music rose and the camera pulled back. Just a woman standing at a window knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly the work she was supposed to do, and that the people who had needed her to be smaller so they could be comfortable with themselves had found out, at considerable personal cost, that she was not going to be. That would have to be enough. It was more than enough. Outside, the last of the evening light moved across the parking lot and caught the glass of the cars and the metal of the light poles and the windows of the building opposite, and for a moment, everything it touched was the same color, the warm, specific gold of a spring evening in a mountain city. And then it passed, and the ordinary dusk came, and the hospital's exterior lights came on automatically, and the night shift began to arrive. Sarah turned from the window. She had work to do.